So when I was a senior in high school, I began babysitting for a single mother, Angela. She had 2 kids, Lauren, who was 12, and Ryan, who was 7. Now, Angela had recently divorced from her husband, and I started babysitting for their family before the separation, so I had a sideline view of the messy situation at hand. After the divorce was finalized, Angela came into a good deal of money and ended up buying a 2-story, white brick old house in a historic neighborhood of my town. Now, when I say this house was old, it was old. The type of old that carries a smell with it. The type you can hear in every floorboard. The type that carries so much history, you can't but feel like memories are seeping out of the walls. The type of old that is pleasant during the day, magical even. But at night, it seems foreign, scary, like you're just a guest passing through a structure that will remain long after you have left. So, when I was watching the kids one Friday night, which was a normal night with them, Angela always said she had dinner plans with friends, but I know she was going to a bar and getting plastered because she would always come home and leave the money on the dining room table, yell thank you in a slurred voice, and proceed to walk up the incredibly creaky stairs, all without coming into contact with me. On this night, it was around 9 p.m., and I had just gotten the kids into bed. They each had their own bedrooms, but slept in Ryan's bunk beds because she hated sleeping alone. Usually, Lauren would stay awake and play with her tablet for a little bit before falling asleep. But Ryan usually passed out pretty quickly, once I could finally get him to stop getting up, for water or to pee for another story. It would literally take 20 to 30 minutes to get him to bed. Anyway, it's 9 p.m. I'm alone downstairs in the den. The actual living room didn't have a TV, it was more of a sitting room. And the den, of course, was closed off and had its own door. There's only one way in or out of that room, which I left open so I could listen upstairs for the kids if they needed me, or if they were sneaking out of bed. As I'm sitting on the couch flipping through the channels trying to find something to watch on TV, I hear a very light knock on the front door. Now, I can see the front door from where I'm sitting because it was a straight shot from the den, and the couch was back far enough that all I had to do was lean my head back. I should note here, the only lights that were on inside the house were the upstairs hall light, the den lights, and a small lamp in the kitchen. The only light that allowed me to see the front door is what it cast down the staircase. The front door did have 2 slender windows on either side of it, but they had curtains that were drawn. So apart from the solid door and 2 closed curtain windows, I couldn't see outside on the front porch. Maybe it was because the house was so old, and I used to hear it creak all the time. Or because I'm a lock freak and keep all entrances, windows included, to any place I'm staying, locked tight. I had seen way too many horror movies to forget to lock a door, so I didn't go peek out one of the windows. I simply decided to ignore it, even though it definitely started up my adrenaline. I continue flipping through the channels. At this point, I'm not really paying attention to the TV anymore. Maybe a minute passes. I hear the knock again, but this time, it's a little louder. Loud enough that I can no longer pass it off as the house creaking. Quiet enough that it wouldn't wake the kids. Now I have no choice but to get up off the couch and peek out one of the windows. Trying to be sneaky, I crouch down and look out the window from a really low way if someone was watching through the curtains that hopefully they wouldn't see me. But when I draw the curtains back, no one is there. The only things I see are an empty street illuminated by the classic looking street lamps and a very dark front yard due to the shadows being cast by several large wide trees. I'm not gonna lie to you, I was pretty freaked out. I'm a high school senior babysitting 2 kids asleep in bed in a large old house that already gives me the creeps on its own. I was literally in the setting of every single horror movie right now. Having too much adrenaline to go back and try to watch TV, but not feeling threatened enough to call Angela or the cops yet, I opt for sitting on the bottom step of the staircase, which was right in front of the door, and playing on my phone, checking the front door lock before I go to sit down just in case. I kid you not, maybe 10 seconds after I'd sat down, I hear the knock again. But this time, instead of being sneaky, I simply peek out the curtain at eye level, just in time to see someone run behind one of the trees in the front yard. Let me tell you, I actually let out a sigh of relief. Where I grew up, Ding Dong Ditch was a staple for teenagers, and I could handle harmless teenager pranks. Usually, to get the ditchers to stop, just simply turn on the porch light. So that's what I did. I laughed a little as I walked back to the couch. I should have reasoned that it was just a prank from the beginning. But as my butt hits the couch once again, I hear yet another knock. But this time it's even louder than the last two. So now my anxiety has turned to annoyance. I've got 2 sleeping kids upstairs, and if this knocking persists, it could wake them, leaving me to the task of getting them back to bed. So, up from the couch I go, I pull one of the curtains back, revealing an empty lit front porch, and proceed to flick the porch light on maybe 5 or 6 times, leaving the light on after I'm done. But instead of going back to the couch, I stand there and wait with the curtain open, daring any teenager to try to ring that doorbell or knock one more time. After a few minutes, I feel confident that I may have gotten them to leave. So I turn the porch light off, close the curtains, and head back to the den. What greets me 5 minutes later is the loudest knocking I've ever heard. It honestly sounded like someone was trying to break the door down. At this point, I don't know what I'm feeling more, anger or fear. I rush to the front door, pull back a curtain, flip on the light, and I come face to face with a person wearing a full-on bunny rabbit costume. Think the Easter bunny, but the costume looks 50 years old and is incredibly dirty. For maybe 10 seconds, I just stand there in utter shock. A creepy bunny costume was the last thing I expected to see. A teenager laughing his head off? Sure. An escaped convict wielding a knife? Sure. A dirty old bunny rabbit costume? Not a chance. The creepiest part was, they're just standing completely still, staring straight ahead at the front door, until they slowly turned their masked head and looked directly at me. That is when I noticed that the mesh eyes that are usually on costumes like this, you know, the ones to allow a person to have some sort of vision, have been completely cut out. So I'm actually looking right into the eyes of the person hiding inside this thing. And that is what triggers my fight or flight. Not because there was a creep rabbit stranger on the front porch, but because those eyes looked so empty, I felt like I might be swallowed up if I stared into them for too long. I jumped back from the window, pulled the cell phone from my back pocket, and went to dial 911, still keeping my eyes on the bunny man, but further away from the window now.
911, please state your emergency.
There's a man on my front porch in a creepy bunny costume. He's been knocking on the door for a little over 10 minutes.
Okay, ma'am. Is he still on the porch now?
Yes, he's staring at me through the window. Can you send someone here, please? Fast. I'm babysitting 2 kids.
Alright, can you give me your name and address? We will get someone en route.
I give them my address and name, and then ask, how fast can they be here? Something is really off.
We have officers nearby. They should be there shortly. Just stay on the phone with me until they arrive, okay?
Okay. Before either of us have a chance to say anything, I feel a tug on my shirt, which almost made me shit my pants. I've been so focused on the phone call and keeping an eye on the bunny man, I didn't hear the kids come downstairs. When I spun around to look at them, the kids peered at me and could see the bunny man, and both promptly let out a blood-curdling scream. This then triggers the bunny man, who begins to bang wildly on the front door again. At the sight of his raging on the front door and 2 terrified kids, I keep the phone in my hand but pull it away from my ear. Wrap the 2 kids up in my arms before quickly rushing them into the den and closing the door behind us. Even through the closed den door, we can still hear the banging. Laura and Ryan are both crying at this point and refusing to let go of my waist. Will someone get here soon? He's banging on the door again, and the kids are awake and scared shitless.
They're only a few minutes out. Can you and the children try to find a safe place to hide?
We're in the den with the door locked. There really isn't a place to hide in here.
Okay. Keep the door locked and sit tight. Officers will be there soon. Can you still hear him outside?
Yes, it's really loud. I'm scared he's gonna break the door down.
Okay. Officers are a minute out. Can you describe the costume this person is wearing?
It's a white old bunny looking costume. It looks really dirty and the eyes are cut out.
Are you sure this is a male?
But before I could respond, The banging at the front door stops. The banging stopped.
The banging stopped?
Yes, it's quiet now.
Okay, just stay where you are. Officers are in your neighborhood. Ma'am, officers have arrived at the scene. Do not exit the room you are in until police announce themselves.
Don't you want me to unlock the door for them? Please don't kick it down. This isn't my house.
Ma'am, officers say the front door was wide open upon arrival. Just stay where you are. Officers will get to you shortly.
But the door was locked. I always keep the door locked. To wrap up this very long story, somehow when the police arrived at the front door, it was wide open, even though I know it was locked. I had even checked after that second time Bunny Man knocked. But Bunny Man was nowhere to be seen. The police did a search of the house, which was all clear. No one inside except the three of us, and they couldn't find him around the outside of the house either. They said they would canvass the area, but I'm not sure if anything came of it. They did leave an officer to wait outside the house until Angela got home. I called her as soon as the police got to us from that room, and I was able to get off the phone with 911. I think they could see how shaken I was. I refused to babysit for anyone for a long time after that night, maybe a solid year. And when I did start babysitting again, I would jump anytime I heard anything outside after dark. To this day, I don't know if they ever found the Bunny Man. I don't know what his intentions were. Maybe it was just to scare the shit out of random people. Or maybe it was something worse. But either way, that was by far the creepiest thing to ever happen to me while babysitting. Ever. I'll tell you my story, but I need to leave out some identifying details. I was living in a very secluded place. I got a reference from one of my friends who was too busy to babysit for this family, who was vacationing nearby at a house near the ocean. The house was less than a mile from the beach with nothing but sand between us and it. There were only a couple vacation homes and they were all pitch black when we arrived. The dad had picked me up from my house. There was no moon or street lights, so I could not see the ocean, but we were close enough that I could hear it. This would have been creepy enough all by itself. That wasn't even the scary part. So the parents leave. We have popcorn and watch some TV for an hour or so before it's bedtime. The kid is about 3 or 4, I wasn't sure. He didn't talk to me at all, hitting all the creepy horror movie stereotypical checklist points. That was creepy thing number 2. I put him in his travel crib to sleep in and settled down in a chair in the room because I thought maybe he'd be too scared to sleep alone in a strange place with his parents gone. Well, he proceeded to kneel and stare at me through the mesh wall for around 30 minutes. I tried coaxing him to lay down and even offered to tell him a story or two. About this time, the mom calls to check in. I inform her he's not falling asleep, and she says, "Oh, you have to leave him alone in there and close the door. You can leave the light on and just ignore whatever you hear. He'll tire himself out eventually." So I'm like, WTF, but whatever. I tell him goodnight, close the door, and he still continues to just stare at me. I go to sit in the next room when this thumping noise starts. It starts slow, then continues to get louder. So I get up to peek into the room and see what he's doing. I know the mom told me not to worry about it, but I had to see what the hell was going on. I look in. He's banging his head on the side of the crib pretty hard. But again, it's one of those flimsy travel cribs, more like a playpen. So he's not really going to hurt himself, but he was lifting the whole thing up a few inches off the ground with the force of his head bouncing off of it. As soon as I went to close the door again, he immediately stopped and stared right at me with this blank and creepy face. I quickly closed the door, and the banging started once again and then continued for another 20 to 30 minutes, then stopped. I peek in one last time and he's fast asleep. Butt in the air, face on the mattress. Turned to the side so I knew he could breathe okay. The next 3 hours of complete silence were a bit torturous. I could not wait to leave. It's quite possible this child had some issues, with the lack of speech and his behavior. But to not warn me at all was kind of wrong on the parents' part. It goes without saying. No surprise here that I never sat for them again. Thank God. This happened around 20 years ago, so the details involved are a little bit hazy. I was in middle school. I lived in an upper middle class neighborhood in a little New England town with virtually no crime. I had just started babysitting and had just taken a whole babysitting course at a local hospital. After putting up some flyers, I got my first gig. It was at a house in my neighborhood, about a 5-minute walk from my house. They had an older girl who was maybe 8 or 9 and a young toddler. Their mom was giving me a rundown of their routine, and then gave me a little tour of the house. We went into her son's bedroom, and she said something to the effect of, that's odd, why is his window open? Quickly shut the window and seemed somewhat distracted from that point on. She hurried through the rest of the tour and then told me to go hang out with the kids while she finished getting ready. About 2 minutes later, she hurries in, sort of hustles us out the door and then outside. I'm pretty confused at this point, but being an awkward, shy, middle school age girl, I just go along with it. Once we get into the driveway, she pulls me aside and tells me she went back to her bedroom after noticing those windows were open and saw that most of her jewelry was missing. Soon after telling me this, about 10 cop cars come flying in, guns drawn, the whole works. The cops told me to leave, so I headed home. Pretty terrified. Turns out the burglar, who had broken in the night before, was still hiding in the son's closet, right next to where we were standing when the mom realized the windows were open. I don't really like to picture or wonder what would have happened had she not noticed that open window and left me there for the night to babysit her 2 kids. Needless to say, that was the beginning and end of my babysitting career. I used to babysit for a family that had 2 boys, 110 and 112. They were a lot more easier to care for than you hear about boys those age are. They played a lot outside in the backyard. They even had a full tree house that they spent a lot of time in. A lot of times when I was over there babysitting, they would spend a lot of the time just playing in that tree house. There were even times when their parents would let them camp out in that tree house. Normally just in the summer, but in those instances, I only had to go up and check on them every so often. This took place during a pretty hot summer. The kids were all excited about sleeping out in the treehouse that night, and their mom told me it would be okay, just to check on them ever so often, and I tended to always do this, including after they'd gone to sleep. So I went back and forth several times. The boys were staying up late, reading comics, and just being boys. When I went to check on them around 11 o'clock, they had finally fallen asleep. I turned off the light and went back to the house. On the way back, I paused for just a moment. There's a light on in the second story of the house, and that wasn't unusual on its own, but as I was walking back, I saw the light turn off. This definitely wasn't a case of my eyes playing tricks on me either. I wasn't sure what to do at first, but I took out my cell phone and called 911. And after that, I climbed back into the treehouse, turned on the light quickly, and woke up the boys. I didn't tell them what I'd seen, but only that they would hear police sirens and not to worry about it. Soon the police arrived, and I watched them from the treehouse as they went in. An officer soon came over to the treehouse as well to indicate to us that it was okay to come down. I watched again as cops came out of the house with a man in cuffs. They had found him, hunkered down in the boys' room closet, holding a knife. I don't know if he was waiting for them, and I don't know if he was waiting for me. Maybe he was just there to rob the place. All I know is I'm very thankful that I saw that light go off. I was babysitting for a family that I've been doing this for several years. They always paid me very well and gave me extra money for pizza for dinner and all that. So after a couple of hours after the parents had left, and once the kids had done all of their homework, I went ahead and ordered the pizza. When the pizza guy arrived, it was a different guy than I'd seen before. He was a bit awkward at first, not really seeming to acknowledge that I was there, just kind of giving me this creepy look. After a moment, he looked over at the car and told me he had gotten the pizza wrong. He went back over to his car, grabbed another pizza, and came back to deliver this one. He gave me the pizza, I paid him, and he left. When I opened the pizza, I noticed that I actually had gotten the wrong pizza. I just assumed this guy was new and had made some sort of mistake. I called the pizza parlor to let them know, and they told me that they would send a new one out. About half an hour later, the kids were getting pretty hungry and frustrated. But finally, the pizza came not long after. It was the same guy. He apologized and we exchanged pizzas. He was about to leave before I checked the pizza myself, and once again, it was the wrong pizza. I called the guy back and he apologized, but by now, I was getting irritated. He went back to his car, got another pizza, confirmed that it was the right pizza, and then he left. I was just bugged by this guy, but happy that I finally was able to get the kids fed. Halfway through eating the pizza, the doorbell rang. I went to check on it and it was that same pizza guy. He told me that I'd overpaid for the pizza, which I know that I haven't. He gave me $10 and I just took it and he left. Thankfully, he didn't come back for the rest of the night, which was great. I put the kids to bed and read until his parents came home. I got into my car to go home. About 2 hours later, there was a knock at the door. I was still awake because I was studying for a big test. When I answered it, it was the police. Someone had broken into the house I was babysitting for, claiming he was my boyfriend. I had to refute the story and identify who it was. Don't think it comes as any surprise to anyone reading this that it was the pizza guy. He didn't know I was the babysitter and assumed that I lived there. He tried to get in late at night and got caught, claiming, "I'm your daughter's boyfriend." Well, obviously he went to jail, and I have no doubt that he kept screwing up on purpose in order to keep coming back to that house. I'm sorry that that family I babysit for had to go through this, but I still watched over their children often.
This happened back in 2010. I was working in a hotel in a suburban area. Nice place. When I first started there, I was both a PT front desk clerk and a PT night auditor. For those of you not in hospitality, I closed the day out on the computers on the overnight shift. I had just been promoted to a day job and had a week left at the front desk before I was switching to my Monday through Friday gig, and it was just like any other night. At about 3 a.m., I received a phone call. The guy sounded my age, mid-20s, and attempted to strike up a conversation with me. I have to give my name when answering the phone, so he gets my name, of course, and starts asking me personal questions. Do you have a boyfriend? Would you want to go out for a drink, etc.? Which were harmless, but nevertheless I tell him I'm hanging up as I had a job to do. He wouldn't give me a name. Instead he said, "Why don't you call me John?" I hang up and finish my shift. The next night at about 3:30 a.m., I receive another phone call from John. He started off with asking me out for a drink again, to which I declined and hung up the phone. He called back about 5 times that night, each time getting more lewd in his comments and just tried to keep me talking. He ended his last call with the phrase, "I see you like singing karaoke. I love doing that. Let's go out together sometime." He found me on Twitter. I had just gone out for a few nights prior with my friends and posted about it. I asked him how he got my full name and he wouldn't tell me. I hung up again and he was done for that night. I deleted my Twitter and Foursquare pages, and when my boss came in at 7 a.m., I told him what had been going on. We told my GM and my security guard put it into his record. I only worked 2 overnights a week, luckily, but when I came back the next week, so did he. The phone calls started at around 3 a.m. and lasted for an hour or so, but this time was a little different. John was angry that I had deleted my accounts so he couldn't keep an eye on me and make sure I wasn't cheating on him. I told him I'm not answering the phone anymore. My security guard will be taking all of my calls going forward. The phone was quiet for about 10 seconds, and then he screamed, "You're going to be with me whether or not you like it. I'm coming for you," and hung up the phone. I, of course, called the police. Luckily, I had my security guard there, so I wasn't completely alone. But it must have been a slow night because it took the cops mere minutes to get there. I called my night shift supervisor, who left at 11 p.m., and he managed to calm me down. One cop was nice enough to stay until my shift was done. And with that, I told my boss that even though I had a week left of overnights, I couldn't and wouldn't do it. Thankfully, they understood, and I moved to daytime hours, as well as sent an email out to everyone telling them that anyone who called for me was sent directly to the GM. Thankfully, everything stopped after that, minus a few phone calls the security guy got for about a week. He told the guy that I had quit because of him, and the calls stopped. This happened in the fall of 1993, when I was 20 years old. In the interest of context, this was before I started college, and I was working in the material prep department of a plastics factory on the night shift. I was the only woman in the department, and my male coworkers were initially skeptical that I could handle the job, but I proved myself and earned their respect. It was hard work, but on the plus side, it also put me in the best shape of my life. It was also about this time that I dumped my abusive boyfriend. He was verbally, emotionally, and physically abusive, as well as an alcoholic. This fact, more than anything, is probably why I got myself into this situation in the first place. I had just gotten off of work, and it was about 1:30 a.m. My car was running on fumes, so I stopped at a local gas station to fill up. While I was pumping gas, a woman about my age approached me looking nervous and scared. She said that she had been at her boyfriend's house and they had a fight. She walked up to the gas station to use the payphone and call a friend to pick her up. On her way to the station, a car pulled up as she was walking, and the guys inside started catcalling and harassing her. With a slight movement of her head, she indicated a car that was parked off to the side by the gas station dumpsters. I saw a large light green car, like a Caddy or a Lincoln, with at least 2 or 3 shadowy figures inside. She said they threatened her, and she was too scared to call her friend and wait. The woman was neat, well-dressed, and didn't seem high or drunk or anything like that. She just seemed really nervous and freaked out, so I didn't even hesitate. I finished pumping my gas and told her to hop in the car, that I'd take her home. At that time on a weeknight, there was little traffic, so I booked it right out of the gas station and asked her where she lived. She kept twisting around in the seat to see if the car was behind us, and when I asked her to put her seatbelt on, she ignored me and kept looking for the car. I assumed she was just scared. A few blocks down the road, however, I noticed she was looking around the car, and she started asking me about money. "Where's your purse? Where's your bag? I need money. You need to give me some money." My stomach sank. I have this woman in my car, and now she's gonna rob me? But when I thought about it, robbery just didn't make much sense. I was driving a 1985 Chevette and was wearing my work clothes, a ratty t-shirt and jeans with combat boots. I did not look like a person with a lot of cash, primarily because I wasn't a person with a lot of cash. She twisted around the seat again and started yelling, "There they are! There they are!" She didn't sound scared anymore. I checked the rear view, and sure enough, the light green car is right behind me. She started cackling and bouncing up and down in the seat. She's laughing like crazy, opening the glove box, looking in the back for a bag or purse, telling me all the messed up shit these guys are planning to do to me. Now, if I had been smart, I would have just driven to the police station. Actually, if I had been very smart, I would have called the cops from the gas station and waited with her until they arrived. That would have been the intelligent thing to do. Unfortunately, none of this crossed my mind until later. In the moment, I just got really angry. I realized 3 key things all at once. There was an intersection up ahead, with cars on either side waiting to cross, and the light had just turned yellow. I had a spare box cutter that I kept for work in the driver's side door compartment. The crazy bitch still hadn't put on her seatbelt. I didn't think. I floored it and passed under the yellow light just as it turned red. I glanced back to see if the green car was still behind me, but the cross traffic at the intersection had just started to move and they hadn't caught up. The bitch started yelling. I slammed on the brakes and she hit the dash and windshield with a solid and viciously satisfying crack. When she rebounded to the passenger seat, I had the box cutter in her face and was screaming some serious batshit crazy stuff. I can't remember exactly what I said, but it was along the lines of, "Get the f*** out of my car before I cut off your face and make you eat it." The crazy screaming and box cutter combo worked. She grabbed blindly at the handle and popped the door open. I started shoving and punching her until she tumbled out the door to the curb. I stomped on the gas, got to the next turn and squealed around it with the passenger's door still open. I made a few more turns because I was afraid that the green car might catch up to me. After a little while, I stopped to close the passenger door, and then I cut across town and got onto the highway to go home. I was on the highway for about 5 minutes before the shake started. I pulled off to the shoulder to calm down, and then I drove home. I told my sister I was living with her temporarily after the breakup with my ex about everything that had just happened. She wrapped me in a tight bear hug while simultaneously yelling about how stupid I was for not going to the police. I've never been so glad to be yelled at in my life. I had just finished my first year of university and had taken up a position as a taxi dispatcher with my boyfriend's cousin's taxi company. For the first week and a half, I worked mainly day shifts until the owner decided to extend the hours to 24/7, and I was the lucky employee who would be covering 3 of the 4 of these shifts a week. The next week, I was working my first night shift alone. The driver would be out all night looking for fares, which meant a lot of the night would be just me. I wasn't uneasy working such a shift by myself since I had worked at a 24-hour coffee shop and was used to midnight shifts. It was also a Wednesday or Thursday night, so it wasn't very busy. The best part about this job was that my boss let me use the internet to play video games on my laptop in the office. From the computer desk in the office, I could see the front door, a portion of the front desk, and most of the front windows, so I could keep a close eye on what was happening outside. Plus, the bell above the door always alerted me to a new customer, so I couldn't be caught off guard if I got too into my game. On this particular night, I was working with a taxi driver named Dave. Dave is about 6'3" and 300 pounds, plus he suffers from severe health problems, one of which made all of his movements slow and painful. He definitely wasn't Mr. Fitness or the type of person who would be able to defend himself or others very easily. Sometime during the early hours of the morning, around 1:30 to 2 a.m., Dave gets a call to go pick up someone in a town about 15 minutes away. He gathered up his stuff and drove into the night, while I headed into the office and continued playing my video game. About 15 minutes later, I caught something over the top of my laptop. My mind froze. I could hear panting, and in the reflection of the window, I could see someone sitting in one of the waiting chairs. I walked to the doorway that connects the front room with the office. Some guy with a massive rat tail had managed to ninja his way into the office and was now sitting in one of the chairs with his face buried in his hands, panting heavily. He was dirty, sweaty, and sounded like he had just run a marathon. Now, the rat tail should have tipped me off, but I found it more hilarious than frightening. A few moments passed and I finally built up the courage to ask him if he needed a cab. He didn't respond at first. I asked him again, and he looks up at me. I took a step back into the office. His face was scratched and covered in blood from the wound on the top of his head. I was shocked and immediately offered assistance to him. He replies with, "I'm fine. I don't need no help. I just want to go home." I asked him if he needed a cab and, if so, where he was going. He told me he lives about 20 minutes away and wants Dave to take him home. After that, shit started to get weird. I called over to Dave using the radio to tell him that there was a fare in the office and that he wanted a ride. He told me he'd be another 10 minutes or so. My hand was on the phone the entire time in case this guy made any sudden movements. Instead of going back into the office, I decided it was best to stay out front where there are two great big bay windows that make it easy to see what is happening inside the taxi office. I didn't feel as though he was a threat at all, but he seemed really angry at something, so I wanted to make sure that if something happened to me, people would be able to see it. So I walked out into the front room, and as I get closer to the gentleman, that's when I see it. He's not just bleeding from the head, but from the shoulder and knee. I asked him again if he's okay, then I offered to call an ambulance for him. Bad idea.
"You don't need to be doing that,"
he told me.
"It ain't like I killed nobody, right? I never killed nobody. Don't go doing that. You don't need to call anyone. I just want to go home."
"I'm sorry. I just noticed that you're bleeding pretty badly and thought maybe you'd like someone to make sure you're okay," I replied.
"I didn't kill nobody. That asshole should have kept his mouth shut. He had what was coming to him. He shouldn't have said those things. But it ain't like I killed nobody. You don't need to call nobody. I just want to go home."
"Okay," I tell him. "But you're bleeding."
"It ain't like I killed nobody," he replied. "I swear I didn't kill nobody. Please don't call the cops. I don't need the cops. I just need to go home. I didn't kill anyone."
Silence for a few minutes. He notices the phone clutched in my hand.
"I fell down,"
he blurted out.
"Pardon?" "I fell," he repeated. "That's why I'm bleeding. I fell. It ain't like I killed nobody."
He suddenly got up and started pacing. He was growing impatient for his cab, and I was scared. Blood was now on the chair and floor. I had the phone in my hand, and every once in a while he broke the silence with another string of incoherent babbling about how he had done nothing wrong because he hadn't killed anyone, and that I didn't need to call the cops because he was a good guy. Eventually Dave radios over that he's about 2 minutes away, and I breathe a sigh of relief. He pulled up out front. The man gets into the car and they drive off. Now I'm worried for Dave, so I call the cops. I reported what happened, and they followed the taxi cab to this guy's house where they arrested him. Turns out this guy had run away from a nearby bar after he had physically assaulted a fellow patron. To what extent, I never found out. He injured him with a sharp object, I assume a pocket knife or needle, took off running, fell and managed to find his way to the taxi office. During his time in the cab office, the police had been searching for him. So technically no, he didn't kill anyone, but he did assault and attempt to murder someone. I also found out that one of the other drivers, Steven, knew the guy from high school years ago. His name is Duke, which explains the rat tail, and he has a history of violence. He also has a history of coming home drunk and cracking his wife's skull open from time to time. Whether he had planned to that night, I couldn't say. But I'm just glad that the guy ended up in the drunk tank for the night. His wife was unharmed, and the guy who got stabbed apparently didn't die. At least, I assume he didn't, since I still see Duke every now and then walking the streets with his glorious rat tail, which means he didn't get arrested. But in all seriousness, I wish you guys could have seen this rat tail. That thing was impressive. It was winter 2012, and I was 18 or 19 at the time. I was working at a petrol station in an average-sized town in England. It was an okay job, good money for somebody who was at college at the time, and it was just a shame it was a weekend job. So while my friends were getting drunk and having fun, I was in a petrol station serving taxi drivers and the occasional drunk. It started off like any other night. Serve people, clean up, do stock, the average night shift work. Since it was winter, the night was really dark and you could only see faint outlines of people walking back and forth even with streetlights. The place where I worked was situated across the road from a pub and had an alley running beside it that led to a housing estate. Around 3 to 4 a.m. as I finished cleaning a set of shelves, I noticed a figure standing in the alley just out of the light but just enough to hide his face. but you could make out his clothing. I initially brushed it off as somebody waiting for a taxi, as it seemed harmless enough. I sat down in my chair behind the counter and looked at my phone and played some games for a bit. When I looked up, it was 5 a.m., and he was still there, waiting, watching me. To make my situation worse, after 5 there was hardly any traffic or passerbys. I had that guttural feeling that he had some harmful intent. I was safe, however, as I locked in till the morning. I stared back in a trance, trying to keep an eye on whatever he would do next. After a while, I needed to use the toilet, so I went and came back thinking that he might have walked off. But he didn't. He was still there. I then decided not to do my last job until my coworker came in to start their shift, as my last job was to take out the fire extinguishers and sand buckets. It got to be about 6 a.m. The figure faded back into the alley, and I didn't see him for the rest of the shift. When my coworker arrived, it was still dark, and I usually walked the 10 minutes back home, but I got a taxi home after that shift. I felt that the guy could be anywhere, still watching me. I told my coworkers and family members about my experience, and they said they personally haven't experienced anything like it and wouldn't like to either. I was very nervous when doing my shifts from then on, feeling like as soon as I let my guard down, he would strike, but thankfully nothing else happened after that. I quit the following summer to go to university.
I worked at a gas station for a brief period of time almost 5 years ago. During that time, I worked overnight shifts. The city that the gas station was in, I would describe as pretty quiet and small. In the overnight hours, there would never be much business. I would be the only one working for most of my shift, and I'm kind of surprised that we were even open all night at all. The gas station was along a road not too far off the highway, so it would get some traffic. There weren't really any other businesses close by though. Probably 3 weeks after I started working there, I had gotten the hang of the routine. But still, I was always a little nervous working overnights. Being by myself in the gas station, not knowing if anybody who walked in there could be dangerous, was something I thought about far too much. But through the first couple of weeks that I had worked there, nothing too unusual happened. But that all changed one night. The time was probably 2, maybe 2:30 a.m. Things were very quiet. As I sat behind the counter, I saw a car pulling into the gas station from the road. The car drove past the 4 gas pumps that we had and started driving towards the parking spaces right out front. But it didn't park there. Instead, it turned and went to the side of the building. There were a couple of extra parking spaces there. Maybe 30 seconds later, I saw somebody. It was a man, and he was walking towards the door. He opened the front door and came inside. When he did, he walked straight towards me at the counter. The man then spoke, saying that there was a problem with the free air that we had. On the side of the building, in front of one of the parking spaces, we had free air that people could use to fill their tires. The guy said that his car had terrible air pressure in the tires and he really needed it and asked me to help. I wanted to help the guy, but I really didn't know how to fix the machine if it was in fact broken. Beyond knowing how to use the machine, I didn't know much about it. I told the man that I probably wouldn't be able to help him, but he asked that I come out and try anyways. I agreed to, and I followed the man outside the gas station. We walked out front around to the side. When we got there, I saw the man's car. It was an SUV, and it was not parked at the space for air, but was parked like 3 spaces over instead. I also looked at his tires, and the ones that I saw appeared to have plenty of air in them. Things were starting to seem a little bit strange. Furthermore, when we got to the air pump, I picked it up to see that it was working just fine. I said to the man that it seemed to be working. He told me that when he tried it, it didn't work, and then asked me to explain to him how to use it. I started explaining it to the man. He stood right next to the building as I stood in the parking space where you would park to use the machine. As I spoke, I saw out of the corner of my eye the SUV start moving. It looked like it was backing up. I was about to ask the man if that was his car, but he told me to keep explaining. I started to, but then heard a sudden screeching of tires. When I looked to the side, I saw the SUV headed straight towards me. I jumped out of the way and got to the sidewalk next to the building just before the car would have ran me over. The car ended up hitting the air pump and then quickly turning to the side. I saw it start to back up. I got up and ran for the gas station door. The other man who had been standing talking with me had already ran away around the building towards the back of it. I got inside the gas station and went to lock the doors immediately. The car outside drove around and then back to the side. I got to the doors, locked them, and then witnessed the car speeding out of the parking lot and back onto the road. I kept the store closed for a while with the doors locked. Nobody tried to go in during that time though. I made a call to the police, who came out a short time later and took down all of the information that I could give them. We did have a few security cameras. Unfortunately, none of them were angled to show that side of the building. One of the cameras at the gas pump saw the car speeding away, but the quality was not nearly good enough to show the license plates. All I could give was the make and model of the car and a description of the man. In the end, that was enough to make me quit that job. I gave my 2 weeks notice the next day and got another job after that. Working overnights at a gas station wasn't for me, and I have a lot of respect for the people that do it. I'm not sure why those guys tried to run me over either. I could have been seriously injured that night.
So when I was a senior in high school, this would have been around 2007, I was out of the blue contacted one day by this random guy on MySpace. I vaguely recognized him, but I didn't know him. He told me that he knew me from school, and that I had tutored him in math a couple of times. This should have been my first red flag that something was off. I hate math, and I've never tutored anyone on that topic. I told him that he was mistaken, but I tried to be nice to him and we struck up a friendly conversation. Soon, the guy, Brian, started talking to me at school. It started off pretty innocently. He was giving me more attention than I wanted from him, but I was kind of flattered by it, and I didn't really think much of it at the time. He was a couple of years younger than me, and I figured he had developed a crush on me primarily because we're both kind of odd compared to the other kids at our high school. It was a very small school. My graduating class was only about 40 people, and he and I were two of a very small number of alternative kids there. He was emo, while I tended to be more of the punk variety. Both of us loved My Chemical Romance. I figured he was into me because there weren't many other girls there with similar interests. Before long, he started waiting for me at my locker every day, between every class. He started following me around before school and during lunch. He started coming to my performances. I was in drama and choir. I tried to be polite, but started avoiding him. The situation continued to escalate to the point where he was sexually harassing me every chance I failed to avoid him. If he was waiting for me at my locker, he would say sexually explicit things to me, tell me what he wanted to do to me. Luckily, my girlfriends were with me and came over as soon as they noticed him talking to me, which made him scurry away. As quickly as it started, it was over. One day he stopped showing up at school. I was relieved but curious. After about a month of him being gone, my friend mentioned him in front of my dad, who was also the principal of my high school. My dad asked me about what happened, and I ended up telling him the whole story. He seemed really troubled. I asked him what was wrong, and he told me why Brian was absent from school recently. Apparently, not long after homecoming, Brian had strapped some fireworks to a cat and set them off. The cat exploded, and Brian laughed. He got caught and was sent to jail, and then was committed to a psychiatric facility by his parents after he was released. I don't know what happened to him after that. I'm thinking I dodged a bullet though, because he turned out to be even crazier than I thought he was. This happened when I was in high school. A few weeks in, I had made a few friends and I was keen on making more, so I would socialize a lot in the hopes that I would get more friends out of it. I was still somewhat new to the school, and one day, I got lost. This is where I met the guy who would eventually become my stalker. He showed me around and helped me get to the class I needed to go to, and we made conversation, and at first I thought he would be nice to have as a friend. A week passed and I had made a few more friends at this point. I wanted to hang out with him as much as I could. I felt a little bad because my other friend was a bit of a loner, so I invited him to come hang out with us. He didn't talk much at first, but after a while he eventually opened up to me, and then he wouldn't shut up. He mostly talked to me, He started asking me advice on life and whatnot, and I was happy to help. That is, until he started asking me to pat his head like a dog and make him wear a leash. It was a bit weird, you might say. I passed it off as a joke, and I humored him, something I never should have done. He started calling me his master or mistress. I asked him not to do that, and I told him that I wasn't comfortable with this behavior, but it was apparently too late to fix things. He started skipping his classes to walk into and get kicked out of mine. He would follow me around all day, and if I would go to the restroom, guess who would follow me inside? I asked him to stop many times. He refused, so I tried to get the school involved. They had no proof of stalking, and I found that kinda strange since many of my teachers have kicked him out of my classes, but nevertheless, nothing happened. He began to get more aggressive when I asked one of my guy friends to help me out with a homework assignment. My stalker overheard this from around the corner and didn't like who I asked for help. After that, he would pretty much fight and harass every male I would talk to. Some would probably find this flattering, but I found it annoying and immature. I tried to tell him not to worry and that we were just friends, but his exact wording was,
"They don't deserve you. They are worthless compared to my master."
I then yelled at him. I do feel bad because it was quite harsh, but I was about fed up with his, and if he wanted to act like a dog, I was going to treat him like one. I thought I was finally free from that cycle. He finally stopped following me around, until one day I found this letter in my locker. In this letter, my stalker gave his disgust for males and his hate for himself, and that he must be evil for his master to treat him this way, and that I must be taught not to shun pets. It was a few pages long, and it was very disturbing. In fact, it was the most terrifying thing I had ever read, especially when I got done reading it and looked up and saw him staring at me from down the hall. He came up to me and opened his phone and started showing me pictures of a cartoon character who had a similar appearance to me, with the same brown eyes and curly hair. Then, he tried to hand me a leash and asked me to walk him around. At that point, I ran away, up to the office, letter in hand. The principal finally had the proof he needed and agreed to step in. The cops got involved, and soon after, a restraining order was put in place. He was expelled and wasn't allowed within 50 feet of me. About a month after that, I was sitting in my room one night, doing some homework, when I heard a scratch at the window. I looked over, and then froze in pure terror. My stalker was standing just outside my bedroom window. He had a collar around his neck, and a leash was dangling down from it. He was intensely glaring at me through the glass. His face then crooked into a disgusting grin, before licking the surface of the window and ran off. I flipped out and woke my parents, who called the police. When the cops showed up, I told them who it was and what he did. They collected the evidence from my window and arrested my stalker for breaking the restraining order. Thankfully, I moved out of that town a month later, and I never heard from my stalker again. I still have nightmares about this to this day. Being stalked was not romantic or fun. It was terrifying, bone-shaking, and nerve-wracking, and the worst thing I have ever gone through. But I do hope that he got those issues worked out. I live in a very rural area of New Brunswick, Canada. It was early September, and it was my first day of school. I unfortunately was held back in my senior year, so I would be returning to high school as a 19-year-old. Since we lived in a very isolated area, the middle and high school shared the same building. I had study hall for first period. However, when I entered, I noticed that there was a new student on the other side of the room. He stood out because, like I said, it was a small community. I walked over to him and introduced myself. We shook hands, and he told me that his name was Chester. Apparently, he had just moved to the area. Being the friendly Canadian that I am, I showed him around the school and where his next class was. As I was giving him a tour, I noticed that he seemed a bit off. He began to ask me questions. At first, they seemed harmless, like how long I had been there, or where a certain classroom was. But then, he began asking me some questions that seemed odd. He then asked me for my home address and Snapchat. And yes, it was as awkward as it sounds. I was completely taken off guard by this. I did not give him my home address, but I thought, what harm could it do to give him my Snapchat? A decision that I would later regret. When the last period of the day came, I had English class. There were only 9 students in that class. I took a seat, and that's when I looked behind me and saw Chester. He didn't notice me right away. He was too busy making out with a sandwich. It was disgusting. He looked up and noticed me. Imagine that you're present at a murder trial, and the defendant turns around and looks directly at you. That should give you an idea of how uncomfortable I felt. He then gestured for me to walk over to him. Class was about to start, so I just ignored him. 5 minutes later, I look up from my book, and I notice that Chester is now staring daggers at me. The look in his eyes was predatory. He must have saw me as the next sandwich he was going to devour. Again, he gestured for me to walk over to him. I know an underwear-sniffing weirdo when I see one. I ignored him and continued reading my book. Then my phone pinged. It was a Snapchat message. Of course, it was from Chester. "Follow me." I replied, "We're in the middle of class right now." He got it from his table and asked the teacher if he could use the bathroom. He then walked out into the hall. I wanted to see why he wanted me to follow him. So, about 5 minutes pass, and I asked the teacher if I could use the bathroom as well. When I exited the classroom, I saw that Chester was about 50 feet away, walking very slowly. This guy was weird. I kept at a distance behind him, so he wouldn't know I was there. He then turned down the hallway that led to some storage rooms and the basement. I saw him open a door, walk inside, and closed it behind him. Confused, I walked over to the door he walked through, and I recognized it as the entrance to the school's basement. There was no way in hell I was following him down there. I just casually walked back to class. When I sat back down, my phone pinged again. "Why didn't you enter the basement?" Okay, so now I'm thoroughly creeped out by this guy. I just replied, "Look, just leave me alone. You creep me the hell out." I then blocked him. When I got home that day, I immediately started on my homework. By the time I was all done, it was around 11 p.m., and I was all by myself. I was putting all my stuff away when I received a new Snapchat notification. Someone had added me as a friend, but it was from an account called "Why Didn't You Enter the Basement?" I knew it was Chester, so I blocked it. Not even 30 seconds later, I got another request. This time, the account was called "Why Did You Block Me?" I blocked that one as well. Then another one came in. This time, it was even more ominous. "I know where you live," followed by, "I'm right outside your house." I then heard a window break downstairs. I immediately called the cops and told them what was happening. The operator said to find somewhere to hide and lock the door. I hung up and went into the hallway closet. My worst nightmare came true as I heard footsteps moving up the stairs. The closet that I was hiding in overlooked the staircase. I then saw a dark figure appear. As it moved into the light, I saw him. It was Chester. As soon as he reached the top of the stairs, he made his way to the middle of the hallway and then stopped. He then looked directly at the closet I was hiding in. It was like I was in a horror film. I didn't want to freak out and give away that I was hiding in that closet, so I retreated further in, concealing myself behind some thick winter coats. Chester then opened the door and peered inside. He couldn't seem to find the light switch and eventually gave up. After moving from room to room, I heard his footsteps descending back down the stairs. A few minutes later, the police knocked on the front door. I immediately left the closet and went downstairs and opened it up and told them what was happening. Of course, by the time that they arrived, Chester was nowhere to be found. After they searched the house, they determined that he escaped through a window in my basement. I showed the police the Snapchat activity, and they said that they would do their best to track him down. The next school day, I went to the principal's office to report Chester. I sincerely believe that he was a threat to both myself and the other students. But here's the creepiest part of the story. My principal told me that there was no new student named Chester. He must have snuck into the school somehow and blended in with the other kids, and none of the staff bothered to confirm that he was actually a new student. Thankfully, he was never seen again, and I never heard any follow-up from the police either. To this day, I still think about what would have happened to me if I had followed him into the school basement. I might have been his next sandwich. In early September, I started my senior year of high school. I was a bit of a loner, and usually kept to myself. I lived in a very rural area in northern Washington state, so it took me some time to drive to school. During my second period class, there was a student named Keith. I didn't really know him that well, but he never really seemed to bother anyone before. I noticed that Keith was staring at me. I was at the far right desk in the front row. He mouthed a few words to me, but I could not understand what he was trying to tell me. As the day went on, I would occasionally see him in the hallways, giving me nasty looks. I tried my best to ignore him, but something about this guy seemed disturbing. Finally, it was the last period of the day, and I was about to leave. However, I stopped dead in my tracks when I noticed Keith at the end of the hall, staring right at me. I acted like I didn't see him and tried to blend in with a crowd of students who were leaving, but as I walked out the door, he watched me get into my car. I remember looking into my rearview mirror to see him standing by the parking lot, watching me as I drove away. By the time I got home, I had forgotten all about Keith's strange behavior. Later that night, I received a text from an unknown number. "I know where you live." I didn't know what to think, so I ignored it, thinking that it was a spam message, and continued working on my homework. A while later, I received another text. This time, it was more alarming. It was a picture of me walking into my school. The number then sent another picture of me in the school hallway. Both of the photographs were taken from behind. Another message then came in. It was my home address. My parents weren't home at the time, so I quickly shut off all the lights in the house and closed the blinds. The last window I got to was in the living room. I briefly looked outside to see a silhouette standing in my front yard. It was too dark to see who it was, but I closed the curtains and made my way to the basement and waited. An eerie silence settled in, as if something could happen at any moment. The silence was disrupted by the sound of the front door handle being turned. Thankfully, it was locked, but the fact that someone was trying to get inside was terrifying. 5 minutes later, I heard footsteps above me. Whoever was outside had found a way inside. I quickly hid under an old desk. I should have called the cops when I had the chance. I guess I didn't really think someone would actually break in. And now, I didn't want to give away my hiding spot. My worst fears came true when I heard the basement door creak open. I could see the light from the upstairs hallway shine in for a split second before it was switched off, plunging the basement into darkness again. It was now silent and pitch black. I then heard a voice speak. It was Keith. "I know you're down there. I can see you. Come out now." I didn't know if he was bluffing, so I didn't move. He then slowly walked down the stairs and made his way around the room. I could hear him knocking things over and getting closer and closer. He then stopped directly in front of the desk. My heart was pounding a mile a minute. All went silent again, until Keith spoke. "Well, I gave you a chance to make this easy, but now you've really pissed me off." At this point, my eyes adjusted to the dark, and I could see that Keith was holding a hammer in his right hand. Without thinking, I sprung out from under the desk and shoved Keith, sending him backwards, and then made a beeline to the basement stairs. "I'm going to kill you!" I heard something flying across the room and smashing into the old TV by the staircase. I would later find out that he threw the hammer. As soon as I got upstairs, I slammed the basement door shut and locked it, then ran out the front door.
"Let me out! I'll be brains dead!"
I immediately called the police, and then my parents. I heard sirens in the distance. When the cops pulled up, I told them that he was locked inside the basement. When they entered the house and opened the basement door, Keith was gone. He escaped by smashing out a window. It turns out that I had forgotten to lock the side door, which is how Keith got inside. I told the police who Keith was and showed them the disturbing messages I received earlier. 2 days later, I was called to the principal's office. I was told that Keith had been arrested and would never be allowed back to school again. Thankfully, I never saw him after that. As far as Keith's motives were, he may have had some kind of psychotic meltdown and decided to act on a preconceived obsession of me. It's truly scary. One day he seemed so unassuming, and the next, he was in my basement, trying to kill me with a hammer.
Last year, I went to Walmart at about 2 o'clock in the morning. I occasionally worked really late, and on this day, I worked well past 1 a.m. I needed to get groceries, and I really wasn't that sleepy yet, so I decided to stop at Walmart, knowing the store was open, but nobody would be there. I got in the store, which was in fact dead, and started to shop. I only noticed a couple of other shoppers. When I got to the back corner of the store to get yogurt, I noticed a man standing next to the shelves, just staring at me. At first, I thought maybe he knew me, but I didn't recognize him at all. He kept a completely straight face. He just wouldn't take his eyes off me. I said hi and nodded my head at him. He just kept staring. Didn't acknowledge me at all. I thought something must be wrong with him, so I got the yogurt and moved on. When I left the aisle, I heard him start to follow me. I tried my best to just ignore him. Maybe he was playing a dumb prank on me or something. I only needed about 2 more things, so I quick grabbed them and headed to the self-checkout. The man followed me all the way there, about 20 or 30 feet behind me the whole time. When I was checking out, I thought about alerting a store worker about the man, but I decided not to. I just wanted to get my stuff and go home. I finished checking out and began walking to my car. I got out of the doors of Walmart and the man continued to follow me out into the parking lot. I increased my pace to get to my car so I could drive away. Then, the man started to full out sprint at me. When I saw this, I ran to my car. I struggled to open the doors with bags in my hands. I finally got to the door and jumped inside. I slammed the door shut and locked it. The man reached my car and tried opening the door just a few seconds later. Now he didn't have a straight face anymore. He had a big smile which looked completely insane. He banged on my window until I quickly drove away. I have not shopped at Walmart since. A couple of years ago, I went to Walmart at night with 2 of my good friends, John and David. I don't remember exactly what we needed to get there, probably food or something, but I do remember that we wound up near the sports cards because John was really into them at the time. The 3 of us were in high school, and we were looking at a box of baseball cards when a man approached us. He looked to be about 25 to 30, was wearing a hood, and smelled like cigarettes. He asked us if we drove here and if we could give him a ride. I said, "No, sorry, I can't." He said that he didn't need to go very far, but he really needed a ride. I still said no, and he stood there for a good 10 seconds before finally walking away. My friends and I then went to another section of the store for a couple minutes before checking out and leaving. When we left the store, we saw the man again. He was standing outside the door smoking. He looked at us, so we tried to avoid eye contact, but he started to approach us again. We just ignored him. The man started to walk with us to my car. He said once more that he really needed a ride. I told him no yet again, and my friends and I got into my car. As we got in, to my surprise, he helped himself and got in the back seat. He said now we don't have a choice, with a smile. I told him to leave the car. He responded by saying he was not leaving until I drove him where he needed to go. Finally, I asked him where it was he needed to go. He replied by saying I would find out when I got there. This guy was being super sketchy, and I couldn't help but think of him having us drive him to a spot to get robbed or something. My friend John told him he was going to call the police if he didn't leave the car. The man said something along the lines of if we called the police, he would hurt us all. We were high school kids and not that big, but 3 against 1 I thought maybe we could take him. But then again, I had no idea what this man was capable of. The man told me to drive, and so I started to drive. Just a couple seconds later though, to my surprise, we saw a police car that happened to be pulling into the parking lot. The man cursed at us and then told me to stop. I stopped the car and he got out. I don't know if the man just really wanted a ride or if he had bad intentions, but I'm glad I didn't find out. I work at a Walmart stocking shelves. I frequently work overnight shifts, and that's when much of the stocking is done. Our store is a 24-hour store, so I occasionally have to deal with customers, but usually I don't interact with them much at all. A couple of weeks ago, I was stocking the shelf of a cleaning supply aisle near the back of the store. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning. I was restocking hand sanitizer when I heard someone walk from the aisle behind me to the aisle I was in. I briefly looked, and from the corner of my eye, I could see someone entering the aisle. I kept working, and I felt them walk past me into the other end of the aisle. The person then walked back over to me and tapped me on my shoulder. I looked, and I could see it was a man. He appeared to be about 25 years old, with a goatee and long hair. He asked me if I could help him with something. I asked him what he needed help with. He just stood there looking at me for a good 5 seconds before he responded. He finally told me that he needed some toothpaste. I told him where it was, but he insisted I go with. So I stopped working, got up, and started to walk with the man. As we were walking over, he seemed to know where we were going and was leading the way. When we finally arrived, I was shocked at what I saw. Just about every item from the shelves had been thrown onto the floor, and there was a huge pile of toothpaste as well as toothbrushes and other items all over the floor. The man just looked at me and smiled. I asked him if he did this. He smiled at me with a creepy smile and said yes. He then took off and sprinted away towards the exits and ran out the store. I ended up having to clean it up. This was by far the strangest thing that ever happened to me while working at Walmart.
It was approaching one of my niece's birthdays, and she's at the age where I think she would appreciate a gift from her uncle. I'm a poor college student with no car, so I commute everywhere and anywhere, knowing that I always take my backpack and headphones anytime I leave my house. So I'm at Walmart and have this care package planned out for my niece. She loves Elsa from Frozen, so I decided to get her a costume, doll, and candy, all Frozen themed of course. Like I mentioned earlier, any place I travel I usually have my headphones in. This is kind of a pain to explain, but this detail defines the whole story. Now I'm so lazy I use a third-party music app instead of the music app included on my iPhone. Unfortunately for me, this requires a good internet connection, and living in rural parts of Denver, my music ends up cutting in and out and then stops playing altogether. Now at this point I have one item left on my list, and I'm in the toy section of Walmart looking for an Elsa toy. Before I know it, this mom leaves her 2 children beside me. I'm not sure why, but this has happened before. Maybe I have a trustworthy face. Let me tell you all something now. There are so many strange things that happen in this world that I would be a fool to leave these 2 children alone. And for the record, I don't know these people at all. It's kind of a pain, but I figured it's just me being a good person. I don't even know how some people can do this. This is literally a woman leaving her 2 children at a section of the store and telling them to wait there for a short while. Anyways, one girl is around 4 years old and her sister was around 1 to 2 years old. The older sister had one missing crock, and her younger sister had pajamas on and a pacifier in her mouth. I felt even more obligated to stay until their mom came back. And I was right. Not even 5 minutes passed since their mom left, and some fool came up and started talking to these girls. I have lots of toys and candy in my car, and a dog too. He probably thought I wasn't listening because I had my headphones in. But like I said, by this point my music had cut out a long time ago. As soon as he mentioned his dog, I immediately made my way up to him. He was crouched down talking to the girl about the stuffed animal she had in her hand. "My dog is really big. He's not pink, but he's nice. Would you like to come and meet him?" I crouched down and pushed the girl back a few steps. Immediately the guy moved back a few steps himself. I extended my arm and shook my finger back and forth, gesturing to him. No, not today. I gave the guy a very harsh look, like I knew exactly what he was doing. I just stared at him very attentively. The guy was very short in stature and had short, stringy hair with a tan pilot jacket. He was also wearing some very beat-up New Balance tennis shoes. He looked very plain, to describe him best. At this point, I was about to pounce on him, and hold him down if need be. I'm not even a big guy myself, I just don't stand for any bull. Before that could happen, he immediately got up, turned right, and headed out the garden exit. I waited with the little girl and her sister until their mom came back. I said, "Yeah, you shouldn't leave your children alone. Some guy was talking to One Shoe over here about some generic bull, probably trying to kidnap your kids." Those were my exact words. I mean, there's no denying what just happened. Anyways, I told her she won't be as lucky next time. The mom just shook her head up and down and swallowed any spit that was in her mouth in a very harsh gulp. I don't know if something bad would have happened, but if my music had not stopped playing, let's just say neither one of those girls could speak for themselves. I live in a very populated city, and in approximately a 5-mile radius of my house, there's at least 3 major grocery stores, one of which is a Walmart. Being a 16-year-old girl, I visit Walmart regularly if I need notebooks or something for school, or if I want to browse makeup and things of that sort. I've never been uncomfortable going shopping by myself. I actually enjoy it, and I've never had any bad experiences being on my own. Until one day a few months back. On this particular Sunday, my parents were working and my little brother was at a baseball game, so I had been home alone all day. I needed body wash and a new lanyard for school. The school I attend requires we wear IDs around our necks on a lanyard. I think most high schools are doing this now and it's becoming more common. Anyway, mine broke the Friday before, so that was my main reason for going out. I got to Walmart and parked like I had 100 times before, went in and went straight to the purse section where the lanyards were. I walked down the aisle and there was a man looking at wallets hanging on the display. I didn't think much of him. He was probably in his mid-50s, average height and weight, wearing jeans and a brown t-shirt. He looked just like an old grandpa if I could best describe him.
"Hi there,"
he said with a big grin.
"Hi,"
I said with a grin back.
"How are you today?"
"I'm good. How are you?" I said, still browsing for a lanyard I liked.
"Great. I'm just doing some shopping today."
Another big smile. I thought it was weird that he explained that he was shopping since I could clearly see him looking at all the wallets on the racks, and I could have assumed he was shopping on my own. I decided it was nothing and moved on my way. I found what I needed and made my way over to the body wash. I was in no rush to be anywhere, so I was leisurely walking up and down the aisle, smelling anything that sounded interesting, when he walked by the aisle that I was in and smiled again. At this point, I was a little uneasy. I've always been taught to trust my gut instinct, and something just didn't feel right to me. I had never had a conversation with anyone in this Walmart before, and now it seemed that this man was following me. I texted a friend of mine to tell her that I thought I was being followed and where I was at as a precautionary measure. I decided that maybe it was just a coincidence. I mean, he could have just needed soap too, and continued on with my shopping. I went a few aisles up to face wash, and then when I had what I needed, I walked around the corner, where I ran into him again for the 3rd time.
"Excuse me, young lady. Can I tell you something?"
Yeah, I said with a quivering smile.
"You are very beautiful."
"Oh, thank you." I was very uncomfortable at this point.
"Are you married?"
Mind yourself that I'm only 16 and definitely didn't look old enough to be married.
No. "Me either,"
he said with a grin that turned my heart to ice and made my stomach turn.
"Do you have a boyfriend?"
Yeah," I stammered as I forced a smile on my face to try and hide my fear. I didn't have a boyfriend at the time. He began to speak again when a man, probably 17 or 18, standing in the aisle perpendicular to us, looking at cologne, walked over and said,
"Yeah, she does. She's with me."
He gave me the biggest smile and stood super close to me as if he was the boyfriend I had said yes to having.
"Oh, I figured,"
said the man. He seemed very uncomfortable at the presence of another male.
"Good luck to you two."
And with that, he walked away. I turned towards the man and thanked him for coming to my rescue. He said he could tell by the tone of my voice and look on my face something was up and was hoping I would play along with him. He watched me check out to make sure the man didn't follow me out of the store, and I was cautious before turning onto the street since I lived so close to the store. This was the last I saw of either of them. I have no idea what the old man's intentions were, but sometimes you just know in your gut that something is wrong, and that day I knew. Something about him was terrifying and sinister. I'm so grateful for the guy who helped me out, but to the old man who was following me in Walmart, please, find someone your own age. I live on campus at a public university in a small college town. It's a pretty quiet existence, but I like the peace, and I'm rarely bothered by too much in the way of general excitement. My roommate and I usually just spend our time watching Netflix and eating microwave macaroni in our dorm. Typical college stuff. I don't really do much on campus, save for the occasional walk at night to our school's computer lab. Most days are generally pretty uneventful for me, with the exception of today. Me and my roommate drink a lot of water, so we have to buy a couple of cases every few weeks. I decided to go to Walmart to pick up our refill, and he stayed behind to finish some homework. I left around 8 o'clock and drove into town to run a few errands late before stopping at Walmart. I don't know what it is about that place, but I dread going there. Something just isn't right with the type of people who hang out at Walmart in the middle of the night. But I usually just ignore the typical wanderers and weirdos and go on with my business. I grabbed a couple of cases and hurried to the self-checkout. It was approaching 9 o'clock, and that's usually when the strangest folks set up camp for the night. I paid at the machine, grabbed the receipt between my index and middle fingers, and then grabbed the water to carry them out to my truck without a cart. I wasn't parked too far out, but I was far enough that the crowd of cars was thinner than it is close to the entrance. I don't know why, but for some reason I hate parking up front. I went to set the cases of water in the bed of my truck, but as I lifted up, a quiet breeze and a lack of grip on my part allowed the receipt to fly off from my hand. I finished putting the water up and chased after it. The small piece of crumpled up paper had drifted into an empty part of the lot underneath the streetlight. I bent over to pick it up, and I noticed something. A phone. It was a white iPhone 5C laying face down on the asphalt in between the yellow lines of a parking space. There was a huge scratch across the black Apple logo, and the thing looked pretty beaten up in general. Now, typically I'm the type of guy to leave things alone that don't have anything to do with me, but there were no cars anywhere around it, and I thought maybe I could find the owner, so I picked it up. The screen was all but shattered, with a huge crack in the top right corner covering most of the thin black piece of glass on the front. It was apparent to me that someone had probably dropped it, loading it into their vehicle unknowingly. I slid it into my pocket and headed home. I got back to the room around 9:15 and my roommate was gone. He had went to the lab to finish studying for his Japanese class. I unloaded the water and began to take everything out of my pockets. I set the phone down on the dresser and checked my phone to see if I had any texts or group chat messages. I didn't. I picked up the white phone and pressed the home button. The screen hesitantly lit up with a background picture of two girls I didn't recognize. They were both blondes and they were posing for the photo as any typical sorority girls would. They were definitely young, probably in their early 20s. I swiped the screen to unlock it, but it required a 4-digit passcode. Of course I didn't know it, but I took a couple of failed guesses. There was no way for me to figure out who the phone belonged to, so I set it on my dresser. I know a guy in my stats class who has jailbroken iPhones before, so I figured I would just take it to him later. I undressed for the night and got into bed around 10 o'clock. That was almost 3 hours ago. I'm still in my room, and it's approaching 1 in the morning. My roommate is pulling a late-night study session with a friend of his, so I haven't seen him for a while. 20 minutes ago, the phone rang. It was the regular iPhone ring, and the contact name was Kara. The picture ID that came up was one of the girls on the front of the phone. I figured it must have been the owner's friend calling to see if someone had stolen the phone. I sat there as it rang a few times, quickly debating whether to answer or not. After 5 or 6 rings, I picked up the phone and slid the bar to answer. I put it up to my ear, but before I could say anything, a loud, screaming voice came across the receiver.
Jen, please help me. Oh God, he's going to kill me, Jen.
The voice cut off abruptly, and there was a thud as though the phone had been dropped. I heard a sound like heavy breathing, and then the receiver beeped, signaling the end of a call. I'm sitting in bed now, wide awake. I don't know what to do. I can't sleep. Jen, please contact me to get your phone back. I don't want anything to do with it.
I used to work at a video store in Los Angeles in the 90s. We had quite a few celebrity customers, even a few porn stars too. It was a wacky work environment that could feel pretty unsafe at times. But that unpredictability was half of the allure. I honestly loved the job and the crazy unhinged customers that came with it. There was a porn star that would come in frequently, I'll call her T, whose visits I would absolutely dread. She only seemed to come in when I was working alone. She would always ask me the same question. Which of my movies do you carry? Now, she didn't ask this in any kind of unreasonable manner. T was a little older, clearly had a whole career behind her. She looked and acted a little crazy, like she was out of her mind. But she was also very obviously high. She'd come in jawing, grinding her teeth together, and her eyes would bulge out of her head like they were some prosthetic special effect. She was skinny from years of substance abuse, probably various personal issues with weight and image. T also reeked of booze and cigarettes most of the time. She would scream, "Which of my movies do you carry?" over and over again with that crackhead energy. I repeatedly told her, over and over, our computer system would only look up movies by title, not by actors or actresses. But this fact never seemed to get through to her. Every time she would start screaming at me. Remember, this is 1995, so the computer I used to look up things and check rentals was a dinosaur. But it didn't really matter because T would always forget. "How in the hell can you find out which of my movies you have then?" she would scream. I offered to walk her back to the adult section. She could see the stock shelves for herself, but she would always scoff, as if totally disgusted at that idea. This is where it gets bewildering because she's a porn star who's already come into the adult film store. "I'm not going in there," she yells. "Lady, you're already in here. What's it gonna hurt to go scan the shelves real quick?" In my head, I'm thinking she's a porn star and she won't walk the aisles and look at the covers. It made me think she was even crazier than she was leading on. What'd she think she'd find in there? Just how out of touch with reality was this woman? Anyway, she would yell at me for a bit before calming down and then leaving. But this scene played out at least a dozen times. She wasn't the worst customer I had, but she came to be the one that I dreaded the most. But then one week she didn't show up. Monday, Tuesday, the whole week went by and still no tea. It was a huge relief, but part of me wondered, did something bad happen to her? Was she getting extra spun out and would come in even more crazy? The reasonable side of me figured that she'd OD'd. When another week went by without her presence, she left my mind entirely. Fast forward a month or so, guess who comes slithering through the double doors? It's T, and she looks like hell. First off, she clearly hasn't showered for several weeks, maybe since the last time that I saw her. You could always tell when she was really unwashed because her hair would just get more and more vertical. I don't know how else to explain it, other than the grease would just hold up this overly dyed, frazzled hair. Her clothes are about the same as always, nightwear and half sporty valley mom. All of this is nothing when I see her face though. She has a huge black eye, and her eyes themselves are just completely insane. She's got pupils like dinner plates, and the outer rim, instead of white, is tinged with a deep yellow. I can't tell if she is sick or more hungover than any human I've ever seen. She comes to the counter and sparks up that same shtick she always does. "What movies do you have? Where are they? How many copies?" I try to be a little personable and say, "Hey T, it's been a while since I've seen you. We still don't have an updated system that allows me to search for those specifics. I can show you the shelves that might help you though." I'll never forget the look she gave me. Just this faraway nod, half smile with her mouth all jittery. She asked me if I was sure, to which I said yes. Then she started backing up towards the exit. Unsure of what was going on, I figured she was in the middle of an episode, would see herself out, probably disappear for another few weeks. I'd heard of mentally ill people being stuck in loops of behavior. Maybe visiting the video store was part of her loop. Boy, how wrong was I though. The door opens not 30 seconds later, and a big, tall, sharp-dressed guy strolls in. I extend a welcome, but hesitate. This guy looks pissed. He's storming right up to the counter. I ask if there's anything I can help him with. He sets his hands on the countertop, and they are blinding, studded with all kinds of gold and silver, crusted diamonds in between them. He calmly explains that I'm the problem, and that he's here as a solution. Huh? I start to come back with something about how I'm just at work, just an employee here. If he wants the cash in the register or the pornos in the back, he can have them. The guy laughs at me, shakes his head, then explains that I've just upset his friend, who was just in here. Oh, you've gotta be kidding me. T, the crazy cracked out porn star who's been pestering me for months, somehow secured backup? I tell him that I don't know her at all. She's just a needy customer who wants to find her films. There's not an easy way for me to do that, so she'll just have to look over the titles herself. This guy cuts me off with a wave of his hand. Says he knows. He's heard every word. He's heard it so many times that he feels like it's happening to him, and now he needs to get involved. It turns out T was pretty much what I pegged her for. This guy was clearly gang or drug related, maybe even a kingpin. He acted like he was T's handler, almost like a pimp or something. She was so old there was no way he had her tricking. I mean, I guess there's a market for anything, but I got more the vibe that he had a relationship with her and for himself. Whatever the case, it's now my problem. I'm looking up at this coke machine of a man, deciding if I should hit the security button. This is just a video store, so part of me didn't even think that would work, but it was down at the other end of the counter, and if I moved, this guy was gonna snatch me up for sure. He states T's full name, then her stage name. They were similar, probably more similar than you'd want them to be. I realized then that T was probably pretty easy to look up in the phone book, if you were clever enough. He then asked me which movies do you have with her in them. Obviously, he didn't want the same excuses I'd given before, so I threw my hands up in defeat. I logged into the computer beside me, pulled up the inventory list of the entire store, started doing it the old-fashioned way. I jotted down a short list of titles that I recognized and just started from there. It took me almost an hour to find every single tape, constantly double-checking the shelves and discount racks for hidden copies. The whole time, that guy just casually followed me around, not saying a word, just watching me gather them all up in a tub on the counter. He'd crack his knuckles, roll his neck, textbook intimidation stuff. It was like a scene from the Goodfellas. It was only after I started to pile up all the tapes that I realized just how extensive T's career was. She was a mainstream actress for like 20 years from what I could tell, and had been produced by some of the bigger studios throughout the decades. It occurred to me that this crackhead burnout probably still received checks for some of this stuff. Now the guy behind me made sense. As I said, I did it. That was it. I told him it'd take me a minute to ring them all out. He asked what I meant by that. I said a charge for all the films. I explained I couldn't just let 80 or 90 tapes just disappear from our store. The guy picks up the bin of movies with one arm, slides a pistol out of his waistband with the other, looks me up and down, sets the barrel on the counter, then asks me if we're good. I just nod, and with a sigh, tell him to take care. I called my boss after I saw them leave the parking lot, who in turn told me to call the police. Both of them showed up 20 minutes later. The police took a statement, and my boss filed a report of robbery, then fired me right there on the spot. I've thought a lot about that guy, who he was, and why they wanted those movies. I work in retail, and there are only 5 of us that work in the store, including our manager. We are a very, very tight-knit family, so we naturally have each other's backs for anything and everything. Tonight, my coworker and I were minding the store, and he needed to leave early for a dinner reservation with some friends that just got to town, so I covered the last 30 minutes alone. We work in an area that has a prominent homeless population, most of whom are wonderful people. After he left, within a few minutes, a very sketchy character came in that set my hair on end. This guy was about 6.5 feet tall, heavier set, and was generally intimidating. To add to the already scary vibe, he was holding a big gulp and a golf club. Nothing else on his person. I'm a shorter, smaller female, so now I'm just on edge. He didn't hesitate to make conversation with me, and it's my job to be friendly and make sales, so I jumped in, hoping I'd learn he was harmless and coming back from a driving range or something, even though there's no golf courses within 20 miles of our workplace. Obviously, since you're reading this, I was terribly wrong. This man still had a hospital bracelet on from his 2-month-long stay in a mental hospital, was very, very interested in me and every aspect of my life. He asked what I was studying, which was psychiatry, and then he was immediately put off, as he'd had a very bad experience. And I mean literally the moment he heard the word, it's like an alarm went off in his head. His whole expression changed completely. My heart does go out to people in this position who are clearly struggling, and it's my life's mission to help people like him. But no matter how much my heart went out to him, I was still very vulnerable. He then asked me the following questions. What's your name? Where do you live? Where do you go to school? When do you work? How often do you work? When is your next break? How old are you? Do you live alone? Is anyone else here? I lied to every single question, and when he demanded my phone number, I gave him the store phone number. I also told him my name was my manager's name, so that if he tried to make contact, he would be directed to someone that is not me. Thankfully, I was able to boot him out at close. Some of my answers were pretty vague, like where I lived, and that seemed to upset him a bit. Still, he left without much issue. When I left, I had changed my clothes and my hair to be a little less recognizable, and thank goodness that I did that, because he was waiting in the alley out back. I did my best not to notice and make it obvious, but I beelined for my car, which was in a parking lot across the street. This, unfortunately, gave him a bit of time, and he soon came wandering out of that alley. I didn't turn around. I just played it cool and stared at the crosswalk icon glowing across the street. It changed and I proceeded, just as I heard this guy sprinting up behind me. It's late. There's no one else around. I know what's about to happen. He's gonna hit me in the head or in the knee or whatever and then drag me into that alley. My nerves break and I finally turn back. He was standing at the edge of the sidewalk just staring at me. Once I turn, he can see my face. He grumbles something and then keeps following. Shit, I gave myself up now. Now he knows it's me. He even starts hollering the fake name that I gave him. I didn't respond, just picked up the pace and hustled to my car. I figured as long as I could get inside, I could probably get myself out of here. Still, I hear his shoes scuffling the asphalt, gaining on me. When I think he must literally be right behind me, I want to turn around and look, but instead, I just break into a full-on sprint. I can hear his steps stop a little and then hesitate. My outburst to get away must have caught him off guard. Just as I reach the door inside the key-in, I turn back one last time. I don't see the man, but his hand. Fingers wrapped around the handle of the golf club. It's so close that I can read some of the print on the hospital band that's hanging from his wrist. I was so terrified and reeling with shock that my knees buckled. My legs totally gave out from underneath me. As they did, the golf club went whistling overhead. It was all that prevented me from getting my brains bashed in. Not instincts, not training, just sheer terror. Fortunately, I fell backward, right into the driver's seat of my car. I yanked the door closed, locked it, then sped out of there like I stole the damn thing. I called the police and then my manager. The guy was picked up and booked that night. I even had to identify him at the station. Always, always trust your gut out there, people. I work in retail. Receiving shipments for our location is one of the things that I do for my job, since I do the paperwork for it. I have to interact with the truck drivers who also bring the shipments in. It's a task-driven job and requires a lot of organization, but also demands a pleasant personality because of all the interaction time with the drivers. Most of them are older men in their 40s to 60, I'm a woman in her mid-20s. This is relevant. Most of the drivers are great, helpful, and professional. But there was this one who was oddly talkative all the time. Nothing really weird, but sometimes irrelevant or mildly inappropriate conversation topics, like stuff he did back in college, his ex-girlfriends. You get the picture. I just figured he was outgoing and a bit quirky, so I was friendly with him, like I am to everyone. Until a coworker, a guy who also works in receiving, but in a different department, told me that he only ever hears this driver talking to or about me. Apparently when I'm not in the room or in earshot, then he's silent or talking about me, asking where I am. Then a completely different coworker said he overheard this guy referring to me as his wife when I wasn't there. So after hearing all this weird shit, I become less bubbly around him, kept the conversation strictly to business. If he ever said anything about his personal life, I would just ignore it and then went about filing the paperwork. I wasn't rude to him or disrespectful, just simply stopped going out of my way to engage him in conversation. There was one time he got a little too friendly in the clerk's office, and my reaction was pretty knee-jerk. I couldn't help myself. I felt cornered because he was really laying in on the lovey-dovey stuff, right in front of other people. It was the strangest, most direct form of gaslighting I've ever seen. As if I just slide right up underneath him, like we've been dating for years. He made a comment, and I spun around and told him, and the innocent bystander clerk, that we were in no way involved, and our communication would be strictly professional from there on out. That was when he turned on me. Everything he said was an attack on my personality. They must be working you too hard. You're far less fun to be around than you used to. You used to be a happy person. I love my job. I'm very happy here. I just don't like being creeped on by old men. Eventually, he went as far to telling other people that I was unprofessional, basically a bitch, just straight up gossiping about me behind my back. And that was when I confided in my boss about how uncomfortable this guy was really making me. I actually pride myself on my outgoing nature. I'm bubbly by default. And the fact that he was causing me to have to change my personality around him, and then telling others that I was cold-hearted, simply just for keeping my distance. That was the line I drew. My boss filed a report. Everything died down after that, at least for a little while. My coworkers would still overhear something every now and again, but it seemed this old-timer was keen to who was on my side. I figured it was water under the bridge at that point, and we just let bygones be bygones. That was until the phone calls. Every day for 3 or 4 weeks. My phone would start blowing up at random times throughout the day at work, at home, and even in the middle of the night. I thought it was spam, but no one ever said anything. The number came up as unknown, so I didn't even know how to block them. Part of me had a suspicion that it had something to do with that old guy. During some of his good old day stories, he'd mistakenly copped to doing stuff exactly like this. Prank phone calls, leaving stuff on people's porches and cars, whatever. He got a kick out of messing with people he deemed to have wronged him. I started keeping tabs at work, asking my friends in other departments to keep their ears open for anything, especially anything the old guy thought was funny. I keyed them into my situation, and that if he talked to anyone about what he was doing, it'd be in a braggadocious way, and he'd be proud about it. Nothing came through the grapevine though, but every day my phone continued to ring. Some days, especially if I was at work, I just turned it off, dump it into my purse to get a little peace of mind. The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Of course this sour old man had the time to mess with me. He drove a truck for a living. He was probably on the phone 18 hours a day. With renewed confidence, I let the calls roll off my back. I'd answer them and call the guy by name, tell him what I thought about him, then hang up. Even at work, I'd look him right in the eye, shake my phone at him, like we were long-lost pen pals. I could see it was getting underneath his skin. One night on the weekend, I woke up to my phone light. It wasn't buzzing, just the constant on and off screen. It was enough to get me. It's an unknown caller. I roll over and answer it. As I get ready to let out a string of vulgarity fly out of my mouth, I hear a loud honk outside my house, and I can also hear it through the phone. Now I'm legitimately creeped out. I get up and peek through the curtains to see this guy's truck in the middle of the street, the same truck he used for work. He hung up on me the second he saw the curtains part, then roared off into the dark. No more honks, no turnaround. I didn't know what to think. First my phone and now my house. How the hell did he learn any of this information? I didn't go to sleep that night, but started putting together as many puzzle pieces as I could. By the end of the weekend, I'd constructed a pretty solid case against this asshole. I took it straight to my boss on Monday morning. I gathered that he must have been stealing my personal information from the files at work. This was the second time I was in his office about this particular guy, so I'd already created a paper trail. When I brought the new stuff against this clown, my boss was floored. He couldn't believe it. He went on to file a second report, but this time he made a direct announcement to the entire company and other companies that we were working with. It was the start of a chain that exposed a lot of scummy weirdos harassing the office girls.
This happened about 1 year ago. I'm a 20-year-old female, and I'd gotten a new retail job at a clothing store. It was my first week, and I had went through training with my coworkers on how to work the sales floor and the register. It was a fairly busy night, and I was placed in the home/accessory department. I was halfway through my department when I had spotted a weird man looking at me. He then says to me, "Hey, can I ask you a question?" And I thought he was going to ask me about a store item. Well, I was wrong. He then asked me in a condescending tone while laughing, "Well, are you even old enough to be working here? I didn't know they hired 13 to 14-year-olds. I looked at him awkwardly and then responded back with, "Yes, sir, I'm old enough to be working here." I knew that he wanted to know my age by the tone of his voice. Then he looks at my name tag. I'll be using a fake name for privacy reasons, but my name is pretty unique. But then he says, "Faith? Is that even a real name?" I just laugh awkwardly and say yes that it is, and just continue working in my department. I get to where the pillow department is, and as I'm fixing the pillows, he's yet again behind me and then says, "Oh, what do you know? It's you again." And he then grabs a pillow, fluffing it, and then asks, "Are there any pillows here that are bigger? You see, I have a big bed and a big house, and these pillows are just way too small for me." I just looked at him kind of awkwardly, not knowing what to say, and tell him, "Well, this is all we have, sir. I'm really sorry if it's not to your liking." As I'm getting towards the end of my department, I get called up to cover my coworker's register, and when I call up the next customer, it's the creep again. He's just looking at me up and down, and I'm ringing up his items as quickly as possible, trying not to talk to him. He then says to me in a creepy tone, "You know, I'm a smell kind of guy. I like smells." And no joke, he makes a loud sniffing sound in the process, then says, "You smell so damn good right now." I just looked at him in shock, not knowing how to handle this weird situation. I just told him thank you and to have a good night, and that I have other customers waiting. He flashed me a creepy smile, then telling me, "I'll be seeing you again very soon." That's about all that happened, and luckily I didn't see him again. But damn, what a creepy ass guy and experience. Even thinking about it gives me the shivers.
This is something that happened to a friend and I while home alone. Every time I tell this story, it still shocks everyone in the room. It was the summer of 2021, and I had lived with my mom at the time, who worked as an RN. Mind you, COVID was still rampant at the time, so that meant she had a lot of work to do when it came to treating patients. This resulted in her not being home for a lot of the time, which meant that I'd have the house to myself. One night, my mom was at work as usual, and I had been home alone, bored out of my mind. With nothing to really do, I call up my friend Chris and ask him if he wanted to come over. Now, I wasn't allowed to have anyone over, but being the young and rebellious teen I was, I of course didn't care. Since Chris lived in the next town over, it wasn't long before he arrived. We played basically all of the games I had, from COD all the way to GTA, while eating a bunch of snacks and pizza. As the night progressed, we started watching a few movies and sort of became bored. Not knowing what else to do, Chris recommends that we go upstairs and film some funny videos for YouTube. We didn't really know what to film, so I just started recording Chris doing backflips on the bed, thinking that it was good content. Keep in mind, we were both dumb teens, and this was the type of stuff we got a kick out of. I'd say we filmed each other doing the same thing when we decided to end it there and edit our footage on the computer. At this point, we're uploading the footage to the computer when I noticed something in one of the frames that I found odd. In the upstairs closet next to the bed, I could see something on the door frame. It only took me a few seconds to realize that what I was looking at was a hand wrapped around the closet door. "Chris, do you see that?" I said. As soon as I mentioned it, he had this look of shock on his face and came to the realization that we weren't alone in that room. As frightened as we were, we began to hear footsteps coming down the stairs. I grabbed Chris and whispered that we had to leave through the back door. As we're tiptoeing over to the back door, we see footsteps begin to slowly descend down the stairs. I couldn't tell who it was, but that didn't matter to us. What mattered was leaving the house and ensuring we were safe. Chris and I went out the back door and hid in the shed until we were sure the person was gone. 15 minutes felt like 15 hours as we stayed hidden in the shed waiting for this person to come out. Eventually, however, this person we had seen did end up coming out, and when I saw who it was, I couldn't help but say something. It was a woman in her mid-50s, and I instantly recognized her as my neighbor. I let out a sigh of relief when I saw her and opened the shed to call out to her. However, as I made my presence known, she instantly booked it and ran back to her house. I was confused at first, as I wasn't sure why she was in my house or why she ran. Needless to say, we were both kind of relieved and went back inside to call my mom just to ask her if the neighbor was supposed to come by. There was a short pause before she answered, saying that she had no idea what I was talking about and that she was calling 911. Keep in mind that my mom barely knew my neighbor, so there was no reason she should have been here. 10 minutes go by, and I see multiple police cars pull into my neighbor's driveway. I then see her being taken into custody by the police, as well as 2 officers by my door. After I was greeted to the police officers, they then told me that my neighbor actually confessed to breaking into my home to steal my mom's jewelry. She knew my mom wouldn't be home, and I guess she saw it as an opportunity to steal. While this might not have been the scariest thing that's happened to me, it's definitely one I won't forget. My neighbor thankfully gave whatever she stole back and has since been in jail.
This happened when I was 12. I was home alone for one night since my parents were in town with friends. I was in my room around 4:30 a.m. when I was woken up to the sound of knocking coming from the front door. I wasn't going to answer it, but when I looked out the peephole, there wasn't anyone there, shockingly. Then about 10 minutes later, the knocking happened again. I put on my shoes and sweatshirt just in case I needed to get out of the house through the back door. I looked out the peephole again, and I saw a guy who looked to be in his early 50s standing about a yard away, but I didn't get a good view of his face, so I couldn't tell who he was. I even saw a knife tucked into his jeans. Then he took 4 steps towards my house. I freaked out, so I went out the back door as quietly as possible. Don't get me wrong when I say this, but before leaving the house, I didn't put on any pants. Yeah, I know. It's weird, right? But I didn't want to waste any time. But thankfully, I was still wearing my tighty-whities. Anyway, when I got outside through the back door, I got to the sidewalk and ran for what felt like miles. I was running for about 2 blocks, and I then walked for about 5 more blocks until I finally found a police car. The officer in the car rolled down the passenger window and asked me, "Hey kid, you okay? Why aren't you wearing any pants?" I told him there was a guy at the front door of my house with a knife, and I left to go get help. I told him I didn't have any pants on because I didn't want to waste time and that I was scared for my life. He told me it'll be okay, and then he told me to get into his car so he could drive me home and then take a look at the situation. I got in his car and he drove me. When we got to the house, the officer told me to stay in the car until he got the guy, just for my safety. After about 3 minutes, he came out of my house with the guy in handcuffs. I got out of the car and I went to go see who the guy was that tried to get into my house. I was absolutely shocked when I saw who it was. It was my mom's ex-boyfriend. Apparently, he wanted to come to the house in the middle of the night to slit her throat to get revenge on her for dumping him. But when he saw she wasn't home, he was angry, and I kid you not, that guy with the knife actually told me that I was his other target if she wasn't there. He then said to me,
"You're really lucky you got out of the house in time to get the police. Otherwise, you would have been dead."
The officer put the guy in his car, and he came back to me, and I told him how the guy's my mom's ex-boyfriend. He said that he'd call my parents to come over and that he'd tell them about it. I gave him my mom's number, he called her, and then they said they were on their way. About 5 minutes later, my parents came home, and the officer told them what happened. Afterwards, I told my parents everything else. They were glad I wasn't hurt, but were also confused about why I left the house while I was still in my underwear. I just told them I was scared for my life and didn't want to waste time. They understood. We thanked the officer, and then he left, and that guy with the knife got taken away. I went in the house with my parents, sat down in the living room, and explained to them a second time the entire story. They were just glad I wasn't hurt or worse. I'm now 23 and I have my own place, and I always make sure my place is locked before leaving for any reason or even going to bed. We haven't heard from my mom's ex-boyfriend since, and we hope it stays that way. I never liked being home alone, especially at night. The creaks and groans of the old house seemed to take on a life of their own, echoing throughout the empty rooms like ghostly whispers. On this particular evening, my parents had gone out for a dinner party, leaving me with the usual instructions to lock up and stay safe. As the clock ticked away, I tried to distract myself with a movie, the soft glow of the TV casting flickering shadows around the living room. The ambience, however, did little to ease the uneasy feelings settling in my stomach. Every small noise made me jump, and the wind outside rattled the windows like a chorus of distant whispers. I decided to retreat to my bedroom, convinced that the comfort of my own space would dispel the growing sense of dread. But as I climbed into bed and pulled the covers tight, an unsettling feeling lingered in the air. Suddenly a chill swept through the room, and I noticed a draft that seemed to come from the hallway. I dismissed it, attributing the sensation to the old house's quirks. Just as I closed my eyes, I heard something soft, almost imperceptible. It was footsteps. My eyes shot open, and I strained to listen. The rhythmic sound echoed throughout the quiet house, each step deliberate and intentional. Panic set in as I realized the footsteps weren't mine. The realization hung heavy in the air, and I lay frozen in bed, my ears tuned to the haunting cadence. Unable to resist, I cautiously slipped out of bed, my bare feet meeting the cold floor. The hallway stretched out before me, dimly lit by the soft glow of the moon filtering through the curtains. The footsteps continued, growing louder with each passing moment. Against my better judgment, I followed the sound, a lump forming in my throat. The steps led me down the corridor and into the heart of the darkness. The air felt charged with an inexplicable energy, and a sense of foreboding washed over me. As I approached the end of the hallway, the footsteps abruptly ceased. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there trembling, my eyes straining to pierce the shadows. That's when I saw it. A figure, vague and indistinct, standing just beyond the reach of the feeble moonlight. My heart raced and a chill ran down my spine as the figure then turned to face me. Panic consumed me and I stumbled backward, retreating to the safety of my room. I locked the door, my breath shallow and rapid. I called 911, and shortly after I heard sirens and saw the flashing lights. They called my parents, and then what do you know? The police came out of my house with a very skinny and creepy looking guy. They took him away, and I never saw him again after that night. I know a lot of people out there would stay home alone at a very young age due to their parents working night shifts, but in my case, I was never able to stay home alone. One day when I was 15, I thought I was old enough to stay home alone. My parents were going to the store really quick to get some last-minute things for dinner. I was too lazy to go just for a couple of items, and I wanted to stay home and watch a movie that I had recorded on TV. After wanting to my mom that they weren't going to be gone for a long time, I convinced her to let me stay. As she was leaving and telling me 1,000 times to make sure the door was locked and to not open the door for anyone, I then rushed into the living room and turned on the TV. Our home has 2 doors. There's a door on the right side where the driveway is, and a door on the left side where the living room is. We don't ever use the left door, and this is something all of our family and friends know. If I ever had a friend coming over, I always made sure they knew to knock on the right side door. Even when we get deliveries, I always leave a side note saying to please use the right door. My family and I make jokes about the left side of our home looking abandoned since we don't use it. My mom focuses on cleaning the right side. Anyway, as I turned on the TV and laid down on the sofa, I suddenly heard a loud knock on the left side door. I paused, thinking maybe it was the TV, but then I heard it again. I turned off the TV and ran towards the hallway. I didn't dare to look out the window. I was scared that it would have been more noticeable. As I was in the hallway, I was peeking towards the door. It felt like I could see how the door vibrated each time the person outside was knocking on the door. I didn't know what to do or who it could be. Everyone I know knows to use the right side door. I was so scared that my legs gave up on me, and I sat down as I looked at the door. The knocking then got even louder. I don't even think it was a knock anymore. It was more like full-on punches. After what felt like hours, it eventually stopped. I sat there crying when I suddenly heard the right side door then open. It was my dad. I looked up at him and I actually felt anger because I thought it was him who was knocking. I was immediately convinced that my parents did this to scare me, but my dad was just genuinely worried and asking why I was crying. I told him what happened, and after he clarified that it wasn't him or my mom who was knocking, he told me that my mom kept saying, "What if something happens to her while she's home alone? How are we going to live with that?" So she apparently made my dad drive back to the house to get me. As I came outside and looked at my mom in the car with a worried look, I started to really wonder if I had made it up. Did the knocking really happen? Or deep down, was I just really scared to actually stay home alone? In the car, I asked my parents if they saw anyone walking as they reached the house, but they said there was no one. It's been 7 years, and to this day, I still wonder if someone was really out there.
"4 years ago, my girlfriend and I bought a house in the suburbs of Central Florida. It was at least 70 years old and was still in pretty good condition for a house that old. It was a nice 2-storied home in somewhat of a quiet residential area with no issues or anything like that. At first it seemed like the perfect house to start our lives in, and that was the case for about a month or so. That was until something happened one day that would forever break me. It was the middle of summer, and my girlfriend had gone to work while I had stayed home sick after going out to a club the other night. I didn't mind it though, as I could use the quiet, and I was trying to get over this illness as fast as possible. Anyway, my girlfriend had gone to work, leaving me to tend to the house. While I did enjoy the quiet, I knew I would miss her as she works in healthcare and would often work long hours. After she left, I rested for a good hour or so and had went downstairs to grab a snack before going back up again. Not knowing what to do, I just put on a movie to keep myself busy in hopes of falling asleep to rest more. At one point during the movie, I heard the tires screech of a car coming from outside. This was weird as there was almost no one that drives recklessly around here, so I could only assume it might have been an accident. I looked down from my bedroom window, and parked in my driveway is a white van I've never seen before. At this point, I'm shitting bricks right now as I wasn't sure who these people were or what they were doing here. Not even a minute later, I hear the frantic knocking on my front door, followed by several people yelling and screaming. I run down to the front door and look through the peephole and see these intimidating men pounding on my door. I speak into my Ring doorbell and ask them who they were and what they were doing on my property. The guy that was closest to the door responded by saying, "Don't play stupid with us. You know who we are, we want our money that you owe, and you're gonna give it to us." At this point, I'm extremely confused and terrified, and I don't want to open the door to confront them. I yell at them that I don't know who they are and to leave. However, this seemed to agitate them even more and began to pound on the door even harder. I knew it was only a matter of time before they would come in here and do God knows what to me. I took that time to call the police and explain everything. Right after I was telling the operator what was going on, I hear my window smash open and see them come in one by one. I knew they'd eventually find me, and so I did the only thing I could do. In the moment, it was risky as hell, but after gathering up the courage, I run down the stairs pleading for them to not kill me. However, instead of them reacting with anger or doing something potentially worse, they all just turned to look at each other with these confused faces. It was then where I could hear sirens from down the road, which was music to my ears. This caused them to get back in their van and flee. They didn't make it far though, as police had managed to find them about 2 blocks away. What police told me they learned shocked me to my core. Apparently, the people who had broken into my house were part of a major drug trafficking operation. One of their buyers had apparently stole $50,000 worth of cocaine and other goods and had smuggled them into their house. Whoever gave these people the address as to where this person might have lived had obviously given them the wrong address, resulting in them breaking into my house. The thought that I could have been killed that day will never leave me. I think the hardest part for me was facing these twisted people in court. I'll never forget them calling my name, walking past these criminals, giving me a look as if they wanted to kill me. My girlfriend and I tried to stay in that house to make the best of it, but it came to the point where we just couldn't. She would become paranoid, and I would often wake up from nightmares about it. It even came to a point where I started having thoughts about how other people from this gang would come back for us. This ultimately started to affect our mental health and even our jobs in a way. I'm not sure why this affected me so much, but we just couldn't live with it. A month later, we made the decision to sell the house and move over 2 states away to a safer area. I hope it stays that way. For context, I'm a female, and this happened just last week when I was in my first semester of college. I attended a community college right near my house as it was more convenient for me to get to and from school. Anyway, last week I had just gotten home from my first day of classes and threw myself onto my bed to relax. Being at school for long hours was enough to make me exhausted, and sleep was the only thing I was looking forward to. I get some shut-eye for a good hour or so when I woke to my dog Mia barking. This was weird as she almost never barks. I have a dachshund, big bark, small bite, and was the sweetest thing anyone could have, so when I heard her barking, I definitely thought it was strange. I dismissed it as her just barking at someone walking their dog or cat. However, it wasn't until her barks went from annoying to defensive, and that's when I get up to see what she was barking at. I could then see her barking into my parents' bedroom. She has her head up while barking as if she were barking at a person. The only problem was that there wasn't anyone there, even though she clearly knew something was there. At this point, I'm officially creeped the hell out while trying to get her to snap out of it. As I was about to approach her, she squeals back as if she was hurt or scared. I take a look at her and I see this minor gash above her stomach where I then covered it. Thankfully, there wasn't that much blood, but it still hurt her to say the least. I grabbed Mia and ran out of that house so fast to call the police. When my parents got home, I had told them about what had happened prior to them arriving. However, my parents are the type of people to take everything so lightly and lectured me about how I haven't been sleeping well enough and that it was all in my head. I know my story sounds crazy, but I saw it happen. I don't care if my parents believed me or not, as I know what I saw. Nothing has happened since, and my dog has gotten back to her normal self. This is by far the scariest thing I've ever seen, as I still can't find the words to explain it. I've had a few people tell me that it was just my dog being dumb, while others say it was something paranormal related. All of these theories were valid, but unfortunately, the second one seems more plausible. I'm not sure what exactly happened, but what I do know is that my dog obviously saw something in that room that I couldn't see, that terrified her.
My apartment was robbed once and then broken into a couple of months later. And that's not even the crazy or spooky part. I just moved in and I got very, very sick. And I actually had to go stay with my parents while getting treatment at the hospital. No one had even been to my new place or knew the address. It was full of unpacked boxes that I was too ill to move in properly. Whoever broke in, they left the TV, they left the jar of cash on the dresser, and they only took my diaries, multiple diaries, and I always buy the same kind, and they date back for years and years. Each of them were packed into different boxes too. Someone had rifled through my stuff, found those diaries, and only took them. They even left my DIY and recipe books, which were the same style as those diaries, so they had to have checked each individual one. This apartment was on the 3rd floor. There was no sign of a break-in, but there was small handles on the outside of the pillars of the porch that went all the way to the ground. Thinking maybe, perhaps they climbed, but I don't know. The second occurrence, when I knew something weird was happening and that someone had been in my apartment, I returned home one night to find the light outside of my door was off. In the moment, I didn't really think much of it, except that I need to call and get it replaced. I unlocked and opened up my door and tried to turn on the light. Nothing. I thought maybe the power had gone out, but then I looked and saw my microwave still had the correct time on it. Something about that spooked me, and I went over and called the on-call agent for our apartment complex. He came over and I waited outside. He came out a few minutes later and told me to immediately call the police. Turns out, nothing had been taken, but every single light bulb in my apartment had been unscrewed just enough so that the lights wouldn't turn on. The cops came and checked it out, found nothing suspicious, but told me to stay somewhere else for the night. The next day, after telling my sister what happened, her and her boyfriend drove from 3 hours away and installed deadbolts. It was against the complex's policy, but the management was just as creeped out as I was. Thankfully, nothing else creepy happened in the 2 years that I lived there. My family and I used to live in a very rough neighborhood when I was a kid, around 7 years old. One night, it was just my mom, me, and my 2 siblings at home. My dad was on a business trip. Around midnight that night, someone began to knock on our door. My mom woke up, went to the front door and asked who it was. No answer. She thought maybe it was some kids playing ding dong ditch or something, so she just casually didn't think much of it and went back to bed. About 30 minutes later, someone began to knock again. This time, she got up and peered through the side window to see if she could catch anyone out there, but there was nobody there. She starts to worry, goes back to the room, grabs my dad's shotgun, and sits in the living room in the dark, just waiting. Sure enough, a few moments later, someone began knocking again. This time, my mom shouts at whoever it is that she's going to call the cops, and if anyone tries to come inside, she would shoot them. Again, no response. My mom phoned the police, and around 2 a.m., they finally show up and do a quick search of the outside of our house while we all waited on the inside. After their search, they tell my mom that they'd found a piece of barbed wire about 4 feet long next to the front door, and they asked if it belonged to us. My mom told them that it wasn't hers and asked why. The police officer told her that it had to belong to whoever was knocking on the door then. He also told her he thinks that they were planning on strangling my mom with that barbed wire when she opened up the door to see who was knocking. Told her she was very smart to not open the door to see who's out there, otherwise it could have costed her life. They said they'd patrol the neighborhood until morning and do a thorough investigation once there was daylight outside. That next morning, as they were searching around the house, found footprints leading to the back of the house and leading up to my bedroom window. They'd also found nicks in the window seal, where they were trying to pry it open and break in, but had failed. Not long after that, we moved out of that house. This incident happened about 5 years ago. This is a story that I never really tell anymore, because most people are either uncomfortable hearing it or make well-meaning comments about what I should have done in this situation, without really understanding how differently your mind works when you're experiencing absolute panic. So here's my story. I was living in a relatively nice apartment in downtown Memphis, working as an ophthalmic technician. I arrived home from work at my usual time, which was around 4:30 p.m. Unlocked my door and went inside. I set my phone, wallet, and keys on the kitchen island, hearing my heavy metal front door swing shut loudly behind me, and began taking care of some errands around the house. Having grown up in a small town, it was habitual for me to not lock my door during the day, especially when I knew my husband would be home soon anyway. I've never forgotten to lock my door once in 5 years since this day. I walked through my bathroom and into my large walk-in closet and began hanging up the laundry that I'd started earlier in the day before I left for work. My front door opened. I smiled with surprise. My husband was home a little early, and I happily called out to him, "I'm in here, love." I was met with silence, and slowly began to feel that sinking feeling of something is wrong crawl up my spine. I tried to shake it off, thinking my husband simply hadn't heard me, and walked out of my living room kitchen area. Standing on the other side of my kitchen island was a complete stranger. was male, older than me. I would estimate in his 50s, just standing there staring at me. No ski mask, no weapon, just watching me. I wondered if he'd maybe walked into the wrong apartment and was going to apologize and leave. But as he continued to stare, I realized that I needed to do something other than just gape at the stranger inside my house. I stood tall, puffed out my chest in an attempt to look more threatening, which is hard to do as a small female, but used a loud, clear voice, telling him to get out of my apartment, that he had no business being here. He completely ignored me, like I hadn't even spoken. Then he began to pick up my things, my cell phone, my keys, my wallet. He picked them up methodically and put them into his own pockets. And that's when it hit me that this person is truly dangerous. I was naive enough to believe this was all a mistake until that moment. I darted forward toward the only other device that I had that would allow me to get help, my computer. I had to take a few steps closer to the intruder in order to reach it, but I still had 12 to 15 feet between us, so I knew I could grab it and run before he could reach me. As I picked it up and turned to run, I saw him start to move after me. I sprinted back toward the bathroom because it was the only place I could go and put 2 locked doors between us, my bathroom door and the closet door. I slammed and locked the first door, and within seconds, I could hear him messing with it, trying to open it. I ran into the closet and locked that door too, opening my computer and getting on Facebook Messenger to contact my husband. I sent message after message, pleading with him to call 911 and tell them that there was an intruder in our apartment. He got the messages within minutes and assured me that he had a dispatcher on the phone and he was leaving work himself to try and get to me if he could. I waited and waited. The bathroom door opened and the intruder came inside. He moved to the closet door and started to break down that door too. Here's the part where people usually start giving me advice on how I should have acted, but all I can tell you is that I was frozen in the moments. With fear and shock, I don't know, but I didn't scream or cry, or search for a weapon in that dark closet. I didn't brace the door or try to hold it closed. I just kneeled in my closet and waited to die, because that's what I thought was going to happen. People also like to tell me that I lived in an apartment. Surely if I'd screamed, someone would have heard and come help. Surely there was something heavy enough in my closet to use to defend myself. Hell, even the laptop I had would hurt someone if I swung it at him. Why didn't I do anything? I don't really have an answer for that. But the closet door miraculously held. I heard frustrated footsteps go back into the living area of my apartment. I heard things breaking, bottles shattering, my drawers and refrigerator cabinets being flung open, and things were torn out of them. I continued to sit in that closet, silently crying and waiting to leave, feeling that death was inevitable. I feel awful about my selfishness in the moment, and I messaged my mom, who lived a 15-hour drive away, and told her what was happening as well. I desperately wanted comfort, and to tell her how much I loved her. I'm not a parent, but I can only imagine the fear and helplessness I put her in, knowing that her daughter was in danger and there was nothing she could do to help. She messaged me back constantly, begging me to keep replying. I told her I would as long as I could, but I also told her to tell my brothers that I loved them and to help my husband through whatever happened next if it ended badly for me. The intruder came back and started messing with the closet door again, mumbling disjointed words that I couldn't really distinguish. I remember hoping that the police would get to the apartment before my husband, that he wouldn't be the one to find me in whatever state this invader left me in. The front door opened once more, but this time it was my husband shouting for me. The intruder walked out toward the living room kitchen area again, and I opened up the door and darted from the closet to find my husband on the ground with him, pinning him in place. The man kept mumbling and at times yelling, but never really put up much resistance. This entire part is a blur for me. I remember feeling like the room was spinning, filling with fear mostly from my husband at this point. Eventually the police found the apartment. It took them about 25 minutes to arrive, which still blows my mind. I know that time seems to move slowly during scary situations, so I thought it was less than that. But from the time my husband dialed 911 to the time the officers arrived, it was 25 excruciating minutes. This isn't intended to bash them in any way. It just seemed like an unusually long time for a response to a home invasion. They got my things back from the man and took him out of my apartment. I numbly went through the process of filing a police report and telling them what happened. One of the officers commented that I really should keep my doors locked at all times. I remember feeling like he was being very insensitive or blaming me for what happened. But later, recognized his words were coming from experience. I'm sure he's seen this situation end differently for other women. Within 30 minutes, the scariest incident in my life was over, but I've carried the fear, the violation, and the anxiety of having someone intrude into my space for years. If it happened to me once, it could happen to me again. If this or something similar has happened to you and you're struggling with the aftermath of it, the sleepless nights, the lying awake listening for sounds of forced entry, the nightmares, the constant check and rechecking your locks, this is what eventually helped me. A year after this took place, my husband and I moved to the Midwest for his job. We selected a safe town with a nice apartment complex and chose the third-floor apartment with only one point of entry. I looked up every statistic on crime for that neighborhood, finding only one incident that isolated for a car theft, and it was the only thing reported in decades. I still couldn't sleep at night. It was definitely better than staying in that same apartment in Memphis, but my husband often worked night shift now, and I couldn't simply continue being terrified to sleep at night. I realized my biggest fear wasn't that something could happen again, but that if it did, I was just as unprepared now as I was then. I hadn't changed anything, other than locking my doors, and I knew I would likely freeze up again and leave my life up to being able to hide well enough or having a door hold long enough to save me, and that was unacceptable. I walked into a martial arts school with an excellent self-defense program, introduced myself, and started taking classes. At first, I was quiet, hiding in the back of the room and generally keeping to myself. My instructor, who was both incredibly kind and incredibly insightful, slowly built up my confidence and brought me out of my bubble of fear. After several months of training, I finally shared my reason for taking classes with him, and he's worked with me tirelessly to give me the ability to protect myself in any environment. I've been training for years now, and the difference has made in every aspect of my life is unbelievable. The meek, quiet girl that waited to die in her closet does not exist. I'm confident, I'm strong, I'm worthy of living and protecting myself in my home. I'm no longer ashamed of how I handled the situation I was in, but I also understand what steps I can take to ensure that I'm safe. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight, but it was worth it. I recognize this might not be a solution or option for everyone. Your experience is valid, and however you decide to cope with your own story is the right choice for you. This is how I happen to do it, and it's worked well for me. Thank you again for listening. I'm a little afraid to share this because I'm not sure how people will respond. Maybe doing so will help someone else that's feeling alone with this. If anyone is struggling with their own story and wants a kind ear to listen, I'm here. Stay safe out there.
For almost a year, I didn't do anything but just work and sleep, and my 21st birthday nearly passed without me even realizing it. Fortunately, a friend sent me a text asking what I had planned, and we decided to spend that evening at our favorite club. And that night, we just drank and played pool. A few guys tried to get us back to their place, but I did the smart thing and just went home. When my friend dropped me off, I was in a pretty bad state. I had already barfed once on the way, and I was fighting like crazy not to do it again. I made it about 20 feet before I felt another puke pushing up through my throat, and my neighbor just so happened to be outside smoking and rushed over to help me. He held my hair back as I retched repeatedly for the next few minutes. He walked me to my door and helped me in when I was finished. I passed out in my living room for the next 9 hours. It's not quite the way a girl dreams of meeting her husband, but it was how I met mine. I had just gotten out of the shower when there was a knock at the door. I peeked out the peephole and was my neighbor. I was too embarrassed to face him, but I didn't want to be rude. I yelled out for him to wait a moment and quickly threw on some clothes. When I opened the door, I was kind of surprised. In my drunken state, I hadn't noticed how cute he actually was, and this just made me more self-conscious, and I couldn't even look him in the face. He asked if I was okay, and I said yes. There was a brief moment of uncomfortable silence before he introduced himself as Tyler. I said, "Nice to meet you," and slammed the door behind me. I was being rude, and I knew it, but it was still too soon to really face him. And a few days would pass before I got the courage to knock on his door. I apologized for my behavior and thanked him for his help. He smiled, and my heart melted, and I just feel like I'd fallen in love in that moment. Our relationship moved relatively fast from there. When I wasn't at work and Tyler wasn't at school, we were together. We spent most of our time at his place, and it was much nicer than mine. He comes from a very wealthy family, so all of his stuff was very nice, and that isn't what drew him to me. He's actually a very kind and down-to-earth man, but I'd be lying if I said that I didn't enjoy lounging in leather chairs and sleeping in ultra-soft cotton sheets. I enjoy being pampered just as much as the next woman. What can I say? Tyler has given me all the attention I needed, but there was one reason that I'd sometimes get jealous early on. Tyler's car. He loved that thing almost as much as life itself. I don't know anything about automobiles, but I remember it was made by BMW and had an M on the back. Don't get me wrong, it was a very nice car, but sometimes I thought that he cared more about it than me. Despite my feelings about it, I was happy to see it go the way it did. This was in 2017. We'd been together 9 months when it happened. We spent the evening at his apartment watching movies, and the two of us were curled up together on the couch, and the windows were cracked, letting in the cool night air. Just after 8 p.m., there was a knock at the door. Tyler got up to answer it, and I went into the kitchen to get some more wine. I'd just finished up filling my glass when I heard Tyler call me into the living room, and I still remember the hint of fear in his voice. When I turned the corner, I saw 2 guys with masks over their face, holding him at gunpoint. One of the men waved me over and told me to give him my phone, and I did as I was told. I almost dropped it because I was shaking so bad, and Tyler did the same. Then they demanded his wallet. He gave that over too without any resistance, and I started to speak, and one of the men whispered to me to shut up, and I did. They didn't ask for my money. I'm not sure why. I thought they had what they wanted and were going to leave, but then they demanded the key to the car. The pain on Tyler's face was very clear. He tried to bargain with the thieves, but they had obviously come there with one purpose. No amount of begging and pleading was going to stop them. His stalling was starting to annoy them, and the taller of the pair warned him to not play any games. He reluctantly gave in and walked over to the table where his keys were. He picked them up and walked back over to where we stood. At the last moment, he drew his hand back. The tall man let out a sort of huff and knocked Tyler across the head with his gun. I screamed, and the other guy barked at me to be quiet. I could only stand and watch as Tyler started to pour blood from his head, and the tall guy quickly said, "I warned you. Give me the keys now." And Tyler slowly raised his hand as high enough for the shorter guy to snatch them, and now that they had got what they'd come for, they quietly slipped out the door without a word. The second the door closed, I ran to the bathroom, grabbing a towel. Tyler was just lying on the floor, moaning. I placed the towel on his head, and I asked him to just hold it there while I ran to call 911. At that time, I still had a landline, and I ran across the hall to call for help. Once I was sure an ambulance was coming, I hung up and ran back to be with Tyler. The ambulance arrived within a few minutes and rushed him off to the hospital. Fortunately, he was still awake when he left. I stayed behind to answer questions, and then the cops gave me a ride to the hospital. I waited while they took Tyler for some tests to check for brain swelling and the like, and everything would come back clear, thank God. The doctors kept him overnight for observation, and I stuck around to keep him entertained. We got an Uber back to the apartment later that next day, and I could tell something was just different about him. As we passed the spot where his car was once parked, he stopped and stared for a good minute. He turned and looked at me and said, "What was I thinking? I could have died, all because of a stupid car." Tyler's parents did offer him to buy him a new BMW, but he chose a far less flashy model instead. The robbery had made him scared to own anything like that ever again, and he even stopped wearing his gold Rolex that his mom had bought him for his birthday. And now that he knew people were willing to hurt him or maybe kill him for things like that, they just lost their charm. We decided it was best to try and put the robbery behind us and move on. Even these days, when we're both successful and can afford almost anything, we live a very humble existence. That robbery taught us both something very important. You can have all the money in the world, all the fancy cars and jewelry, but nothing is worth losing your life over.